There's a certain hour of the night quiet, weightless, suspended between breath and memory when the world seems to loosen around the edges. The day's noise folds itself away, the streets empty into silence, and even the shadows begin to rest. But for those of us still awake, wandering the thin places between exhaustion and awareness, the night becomes something else entirely. It begins to breathe, it begins to watch, and sometimes it begins to answer. So, wherever you're listening from tonight, beneath warm blankets, beside a fading lamp, or hidden away in a small room where the only light comes from the screen in your hand, settle into the dark with me. Let the quiet wrap around your shoulders. Let the wind outside your window fade into nothing but a soft heartbeat. Because the stories you're about to hear aren't loud. They don't leap or scream. They arrive the same way fear does in the real world. Gently, slowly, like a shadow taking shape in the corner of your eye. Tonight, we're stepping into corridors where footsteps follow too perfectly behind, laboratories where healing becomes hunger, hospitals where time keeps its own ledger, gardens that remember what's buried beneath them, and radio booths where the future leans in close enough to whisper your name. This is your midnight companion, guiding you through 5 stories made for the hour when dreams grow thin and the world forgets to guard its edges. Hold still. Breathe slow. The night has a story for you. The Skyway Drifter. If you ever find yourself alone on a skyway after midnight, there's something you should know. You're never really alone. That's what Ethan learned on a night when the city felt hollow, as though the tall glass towers had exhaled everyone out of their lungs and left only him wandering the veins that connected them. He had always liked the skyways, those long, enclosed bridges hung between office buildings, because they gave him the illusion of movement without exposure, of distance without weather. But that night, as he stepped into one of the older passageways, something felt misaligned, as if the space had settled in the wrong shape. He couldn't explain it at first, just a shift in the air, a faint temperature drop brushing against the side of his neck, like a hand deciding whether or not to fall into place. Ethan paused, pulling his laptop bag tighter against his shoulder. The fluorescent lights above him flickered with an agitated hum, and the translucent panels beneath his feet showed only the blurred suggestions of the streetlights far below. Everything looked as it always did, only slightly quieter. The kind of hush that did not seem like absence, but anticipation. You're overworked, he told himself. Long shifts, too much caffeine. Calm down. Still, his fingers tightened on the strap. His breath formed the faintest mist in the cool air. Strange, given that the climate control usually kept these bridges warm even at night. He rubbed his thumb against his palm to ground himself, and continued on. He had made it about 10 steps before he heard it. The sound echoed faintly along the length of the corridor. A single footstep landing on the linoleum behind him. Not close, not threatening, just placed, deliberate. Ethan froze. His reflection wavered on the glass beside him, distorted slightly by the uneven lighting. He turned slowly, expecting maybe a building security guard or another late-night worker heading home, someone he might nod to, relieved at the presence of another human being. But the skyway behind him was empty. He stared down its length, heart drumming an unsteady rhythm beneath his ribs. The light stretched on for perhaps 100 feet, ending at a glass door leading into the insurance building where he had worked earlier that week. Rows of lights hummed softly. Nothing moved. Great, he muttered to himself. Now you're hearing things. But when he shifted his weight, preparing to continue walking, the stillness behind him broke. Another footstep, soft, measured, landing exactly when his own heel touched the floor. Ethan didn't turn this time. Turning felt like admitting something was wrong. Instead, he increased his pace, lengthening his stride in a way he hoped looked casual, though his pulse had begun to race. The skyway's narrow shape made the acoustics unpredictable. Sound bounced in strange ways, sometimes carrying from blocks away. It's just echo, he thought, your own walking pattern doubling back at you. But his footsteps were uneven now, lighter, rushed, and the ones behind him were steady, consistent, like someone who wasn't concerned with keeping up, only with maintaining a set distance, 30 meters. He didn't know how he knew that number. but something inside him whispered it, the way a childhood memory resurfaces not because you remember it, but because something nearby reminds you of its shape, 30 meters behind. Not closer, not farther, just there. Ethan swallowed hard. Each breath scraped the inside of his throat, as if the air itself were made of dust. He forced himself not to look back. The skyway stretched on ahead, a pale corridor washed in the sterile glow of office building lighting. The city skyline hovered in fractured reflections on the glass panels, the night breeze outside rattling faintly against the structure with a thin metallic tremor like a quiet warning. Ethan tried to regulate his breathing. His job as a programmer often kept him up late, sometimes until dawn. He knew how exhaustion could turn shadows into shapes and sounds into stories. Once, during a crunch week, he had sworn he heard someone whisper his name in the server room. Sleep deprivation made liars of the senses, but this felt different, sharper, as if the hallway itself were paying attention. He walked faster. The steps behind him matched him beat for beat. A trickle of cold crept down his spine. His fingers twitched at his sides. He considered stopping abruptly, letting whoever it was or whatever he imagined either collide into him or expose their presence by breaking the rhythm. But fear held him back. Fear of turning and seeing nothing. Fear of turning and seeing something. It's fine, he told himself. You're in a locked skyway. Nothing can get in here unless they have a badge. For all you know, it's just someone heading to the parking lot. Yet his body rebelled against that logic. Some instinct buried in the oldest part of his brain screamed at him that the presence behind him was wrong. Not dangerous the way a mugger is dangerous. Dangerous the way a cliff edge becomes dangerous when the fog rolls in and you lose sight of the ground. He reached the midpoint of the skyway. One of the lights above him flickered, buzzing impatiently. He glanced up at it, hoping to break the illusion of pursuit, to convince himself that the light was the source of the unease. But when he looked forward again, his heart lurched. The frosted paneling ahead seemed dimmer. The further section of the hall looked as though it were receding, expanding in subtle ways that defied perspective. A strange vertigo settled over him, making the floor feel less stable, less certain. He slowed, overcome by the sensation that he was inside something that was breathing too slowly to be noticed unless he stood still. And then behind him, a pause, a complete stop. His own breath froze. The sudden silence rang louder than footsteps. He didn't turn, didn't dare. Every hair on his arms lifted. He felt watched, but not by eyes, by attention itself. Seconds passed. 5, 10. The pause held. Then, one step, deliberate, soft, closer, not much closer. Maybe a foot, maybe less. As if the thing behind him had adjusted its position to maintain that perfect distance. 30 meters. Ethan's throat tightened. He felt his control slipping, the rational part of his mind fraying at the edges. He needed to reach the end of the skyway. Just a few more yards, through the maintenance alcove, then down the elevator to street level. He walked, not fast. That might have broken whatever fragile equilibrium existed between him and the unseen figure, but every step felt like stepping into deeper water. The footsteps followed. The air grew colder. The hum of the lights flattened into a trembling drone, as though the electricity itself were holding its breath. Halfway to the exit door, Ethan saw something strange. A smear on the glass, long, pale, almost chalk-like. Not the shape of a handprint or a drip, more like a dragging motion, as though someone had pressed a cloth or sleeve against the window and drawn it in a slow, uneven line. He stopped involuntarily, leaning closer to examine it. The smear was faint but undeniable, catching what little light there was in the corridor. It looked fresh. He stared at it, mind racing. Did someone lean here earlier? A janitor? A maintenance worker? But the dust around it suggested the glass hadn't been cleaned in weeks, and the smear wasn't smudged. You could see the pressure point where it began, tapering as though the arm had lifted. Ethan felt the cold deepen at his back. He didn't hear the footsteps anymore. He didn't hear anything at all. It was as if the entire skyway had wilted into silence, slowly. He drew in a breath. The kind of breath one takes before opening a door you're not sure is locked. He turned just enough to glance over his shoulder, no more than a few degrees, just enough to glimpse the corridor behind him. The passage was empty, yet the air was wrong, thick, occupied. The temperature dropped another degree. His breath misted. Ethan turned forward again and nearly stumbled. Another smear, this one on the opposite window, higher, angled slightly downward, as if someone very tall had dragged their sleeve or coat against it while walking. He felt the pieces sliding together in the back of his mind, each one bringing with it a fresh wave of dread. A tall figure, moving quietly, keeping exactly 30 meters behind me. The scrape of something soft brushed the floor behind him. Ethan didn't think. He ran. The corridor blurred around him as he sprinted toward the far end. His footsteps slammed into the linoleum, echoing wildly off the glass. Behind him, he heard it, the second set of steps falling into perfect synchrony, matching his pace with impossible precision. Not hurried, not strained, simply compelled. 30 meters, always 30. His lungs burned, his bag banged against his hip. He could hear his own heartbeat rising in tempo, pounding against his throat. Ahead, the outline of the maintenance alcove appeared, a narrow, recessed doorway used for equipment storage. Beyond it, only 15 feet away, was the exit. He just needed to reach it, just needed to get inside an elevator, close the doors. Something creaked behind him, a sharp metallic tremor, like a wire pulled too tightly. Ethan didn't look. He couldn't. His legs were shaking, his vision beginning to pulse at the edges, but he forced himself forward. He reached the alcove. His hand shot out, gripping the handle of the maintenance door. It didn't budge. Locked. He tugged harder, fingers slipping. The handle rattled uselessly in its socket, refusing him. "Come on," he whispered. Voice cracked with desperation. "Please, just..." A sound drifted down the hall, a slow, soft tap, followed by another, and another, measured, precise, exactly spaced, like a clock, counting down. Ethan's knees nearly buckled. He pressed his forehead to the cool metal of the door, breathing hard. Panic flooded his veins. His rational mind dissolved, leaving only instinct deep, animal, terrified. He wasn't alone, and whatever stood 30 meters behind him had stopped pretending to walk. It was waiting. Ethan did not know how long he stood, with his forehead pressed against the cold metal of the maintenance door. Time stretched thin in the skyway, as if the fluorescent lights themselves pulled it taut each time they flickered. His breath fogged the steel in uneven pulses, short, panicked bursts that contradicted the steady tap, tap, tap echoing from behind him. He didn't turn. Not yet. Every instinct screamed that to face whatever stood 30 meters away was to acknowledge it could be seen, and he wasn't sure seeing would make anything better. The rhythm continued, slow, deliberate taps against the smooth floor. Not footsteps now. Something else. Something softer, as though fabric were brushing the ground and only occasionally catching against the ridges of the linoleum. He shut his eyes, trying to summon logic. He had lived in the city for 8 years. He had used these skyways hundreds of times. He knew their quirks, their drafts, their structural groans, their echo chambers that sometimes made distant sounds feel close. But nothing in those years had ever sounded like this. His phone buzzed suddenly in his pocket, and he nearly cried out. It was just a notification, but the vibration against his thigh jolted him into breathing again. Call someone, he thought. Anyone. He pulled his phone out with trembling hands. No signal. Not even a weak bar. Just a dead gray icon in the corner of the screen. "That's impossible," he whispered. Even the oldest skyways had signal repeaters built in. You could live stream inside one without interruption. But his phone displayed the same blank void every time he tilted it toward the ceiling, as if the building itself were swallowing the signal. Behind him, the tapping paused. Ethan felt the silence settle on his shoulders like a weight. He pressed himself harder against the maintenance door, feeling the faint unevenness of the metal, the small dents worn into it by decades of equipment carts bumping their way through. He grasped the handle again, not because he believed it would open now, but because touching something grounded him. Another sound rippled through the corridor, a soft, hollow drag like fingertips gliding along glass. His throat clenched. Slowly, as though afraid of sending a signal through the air, he turned his head just enough to see the window beside him. Nothing, just the city lights trembling far below and his own faint outline reflected back at him. But the glass was fogged. A smeared, cloudy print hovered at eye level, long, pale, and slightly curved, as though something had pressed close enough to breathe onto it. Close, far closer than 30 meters. Ethan jerked away from the window, stumbling a step sideways. His shoulder struck the wall, and the impact sent a dull vibration through the metal frame of the skyway. The fluorescent tubes overhead buzzed in protest. "No," he said under his breath. "No, no, no, this is not real. I'm tired. I'm hallucinating. This is..." A whisper cut through the silence. Not spoken, not human. More like fabric expanding, a coat settling on invisible shoulders. Ethan's skin crawled with cold pins. He clutched his laptop bag against his chest, unsure whether he meant to use it as a shield or a weapon. His breath hitched as he forced himself to look down the length of the corridor. At first he thought the space was empty. The lights flickered, distorting the distance in shuddering waves. The glass walls reflected faint glimpses of the city, bending the horizon into trembling shards. Everything appeared normal, but as the flicker steadied, Ethan saw it. Not a figure, not a face, just an outline. A long, dark silhouette at the very edge of visibility, too tall to be a person, too narrow to be a shadow. Its edges wavered softly, as though rippling in a wind he could not feel. No legs beneath it, no feet. Just a coat-shaped form hanging upright, suspended inches above the floor, 30 meters away. Exactly. Ethan's breath seized in his lungs. The silhouette didn't move closer, but it didn't need to. Its presence felt like a pressure at the back of his mind, a silent insistence that he was not allowed to leave this corridor alone. He wanted to run, but to run would draw its attention. To stay might invite it closer. Neither option felt survivable. His eyes darted toward the far end of the skyway, the glass door leading into the neighboring building. Only 20 feet away. He could reach it in seconds if he didn't lose his nerve. But the hallway bends, he thought. The reflection will hide it until the last second. I won't know if it's moving. He glanced back at the silhouette, still 30 meters away. Still, perfectly still. He inhaled deeply, steadying his trembling knees. On 3, he whispered to himself, his voice cracking. 1, 2. The tapping resumed, not behind him this time, beside him, on the maintenance door. Ethan recoiled so violently he nearly fell. The handle rattled as something on the other side or something pressed against the door itself tapped a slow, deliberate pattern. 3 taps. A pause. 2 taps. A longer pause. Then 3 again. 3, 2, 3. A sequence. A rhythm. A message. No. He breathed. Don't do that. Don't. Please stop. The tapping obeyed. Silence swallowed the air again. Ethan pressed his back against the opposite wall, staring at the maintenance door as though it might pulse outward. He didn't understand how anything could be inside. The maintenance rooms weren't connected to the outside. They were sealed, accessible only through that locked handle. Unless... He turned slowly toward the window next to the door. The fog smear was larger now, wider, as though a face or something shaped like a face had pressed close enough to exhale across the entire surface, except there was nothing behind the glass, only the skyway interior reflected back at him. He looked down the hall again. The silhouette had moved. It stood perhaps 20 meters away now, not floating forward, not walking, just present at a new distance, as if it had stepped through the dim light when he blinked. Ethan felt his pulse hammering against his ribs. "I have to go," he whispered. His voice shook so violently he barely recognized it. "I can't stay here." He clutched his laptop bag, dug his nails into its fabric, and forced his legs to move. 1 step, then another. He kept his eyes forward, refusing to look back. The cold deepened around him, each breath a thin tremor in the air. 10 feet, 8, 6. He reached for the door handle ahead. Something brushed his shoulder. Not a hand, not fingers, something weightless but deliberate. Like the hem of a coat sliding across his sleeve, Ethan jumped away, slamming into the glass wall. His breath burst from him in a strangled gasp. He stared wildly down the corridor. The silhouette still stood in place 20 meters away, but the smear on the glass beside him, it grew another inch, a pale, cooling bloom spreading outward. Something had been next to him, something he couldn't see. He lunged for the exit door, grabbing the handle with shaking fingers. The mechanism clicked softly. Not a lock, just the old hydraulics. He pushed. The door didn't move. No. He shoved harder, planting his shoulder against the glass. The door gave a little but seemed weighted from the other side, as though the air itself pressed back. Behind him, the tapping resumed, but this time it wasn't on the floor. It wasn't on the maintenance door. It was on the window beside him. Light, delicate taps like someone drumming their nails or knuckles against the glass. But the movement didn't match any human rhythm. It wasn't random. It wasn't hurried. It was patient. Tick, tock, tick, tock. A perfect imitation of a pendulum clock. The silhouette drifted closer, not walking, not floating. Just appearing again, now 15 meters away. Ethan slammed his fist into the exit door. Open. Please open. The tapping quickened. Tick-tock, 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 tick-tock. He pressed his face to the narrow seam between the door and the frame, trying to see into the building beyond. The lights inside were dim, the lobby empty. No movement, no security guards, no sign that anyone had been here in hours. The pressure against the door eased suddenly. The hydraulic gave way. The door swung inward with a long, reluctant sigh. Ethan stumbled through, nearly collapsing onto the carpet on the other side. He grabbed the door handle instinctively, ready to slam it behind him, but before he could, the tapping stopped. Silence, complete and expectant. He hesitated, fingers tightening on the metal edge. Then, from just beyond the threshold, low and close to the glass, two soft knocks, perfectly spaced, perfectly measured. Tick, tock. Ethan slammed the door shut with all his strength. His breath hitched in his throat. He held the handle as if it might be torn from him if he let go. Nothing pushed back, and the hall outside remained silent. He stood there for nearly a minute before daring to loosen his grip. The cold air from the skyway lingered on his skin, leaving a numbing electricity where the unseen presence had brushed against him. Slowly, shakily, he straightened. His legs trembled beneath him, but he forced himself to move toward the elevator. He didn't look back, not at the glass, not at the door, not at the faint reflection he thought he glimpsed in the window's corner. He pressed the elevator button, praying it would come quickly. As it descended from the upper floors, he listened for footsteps, for tapping, for anything that suggested the 30-meter shadow had followed him inside. But the only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the whisper of his own breath, trying to convince him that he had escaped. For now. Ethan remained inside the elevator for several seconds after the doors closed, feeling the walls hum faintly around him as though the small chamber were absorbing the panic that still clung to his skin. And when the doors opened onto the empty lobby, its dim lamps stretching long shadows across potted plants and abandoned reception desks, he stepped out with the fragile hope that simply being away from the skyway would allow the feverish tension in his mind to break. Outside, the city air was cool and metallic, brushing against his face with the scent of distant rain, and for a moment he convinced himself that he had left the strange presence behind. Yet, as he walked, the glowing skyway above him, glimmering like a suspended artery of pale glass, that fragile sense of relief began to thin when he became aware, not of a sound precisely, but of a subtle disturbance in the air behind him, an echo of footfalls so faint he might have dismissed it as the shifting of distant traffic, were it not for the peculiar way it seemed to maintain a steady distance, neither approaching nor fading, simply lingering with a quiet persistence that made his pulse stumble. He continued toward his apartment, his strides measured, his breath rising in tense, shallow waves, and every time he turned a corner the sensation of a second rhythm behind him, soft, patient, and unwavering, returned like a shadow stretching just beyond the reach of the street lamps. By the time he entered the safety of his building, the glass doors sliding shut behind him with a soft sigh. His nerves trembled so visibly he could feel the weight of his own heartbeat against his ribs, and as the elevator carried him to the 7th floor, he tried to explain to himself that exhaustion was crafting phantoms out of echoes. Yet when he stepped into the hallway and saw the faint tremor in the reflection of the steel elevator doors, as though a tall, vertical shape were wavering 30 meters away near the building's entrance, his breath caught in his throat and he hurried to his apartment with the pressing need to put a locked door between himself and the idea that something might have followed. Once inside, surrounded by familiar clutter and the soft glow of warm lamps, Ethan almost believed he could reclaim his sense of control. But when he approached the window overlooking the street and saw the glass slowly fogging from the outside 7 stories up, where no human breath could reach, he felt a cold blooming through his chest that no rational explanation could thaw. The fog expanded into a soft smear, dragging downward in a slow arc, as though a sleeve had brushed across it, and as Ethan backed away, trembling, he caught a reflection in the distant windows of the opposite building, a narrow, impossibly tall shape lingering precisely 30 meters away. Its presence felt more than seen, as if it were carved out of the air itself. His phone vibrated then, displaying full signal now that he was far from the skyway, and he snatched it up as though the ability to call for help might anchor him. But before he could dial, a notification lit the screen motion detected near apartment 7D window, and when he opened the attached image, his stomach twisted violently at the sight of a dark, coat-like blur pressed impossibly close to the glass, surrounded by the faint halo of fresh condensation. The timestamp, perfectly in focus, read that the motion had been detected 30 meters away, a distance that made no sense inside a sealed apartment on the 7th floor. And as Ethan dropped the phone, a soft rhythmic sound emerged from the window behind him, not quite tapping and not quite knocking, but a slow, deliberate pulse that mimicked the steady swing of a clock's pendulum, an intimate reminder that the thing he had tried so desperately to leave behind had not only followed him, but had brought its precise, impossible distance into the very heart of his home. Ethan stood completely still, caught between the instinct to run and the equally powerful terror that moving would draw the attention of the thing lingering beyond the window. And in that stretched moment he became aware of how unnaturally quiet the apartment had become, as though the walls themselves were listening, absorbing every small tremor of his breath. He felt the air pressing around him, growing heavier with each passing second, and when he forced himself to take a step back from the window, the faint mist on the glass pulsed outward in a slow expansion, almost as if responding to the shift in his weight, mimicking the rise and fall of a breath that did not belong to him. His mind scrambled to assemble explanations, faulty sensors, reflections, tricks of exhaustion, but each attempt collapsed beneath the memory of the perfect 30-meter distance that had stalked him from the skyway to the street, from the street to the building, and now into the very geometry of his home, a distance that seemed not to measure space, but to define relationship, as though the thing outside had fixed itself to him with a mathematical certainty that no locked door or 7th-floor window could interrupt. He moved backward slowly, one foot brushing the carpet, feeling every fiber shift beneath him with unnervingly exaggerated detail, and as he reached the center of the room, the rhythmic pulse at the window ceased, not abruptly, but with a gradual fading, like a clock winding down into silence, and the sudden absence of sound made the room feel immediately smaller, as though the quiet itself were pressing inward. Ethan's eyes drifted reluctantly back toward the window, searching for any sign of movement, and at first the faint fog seemed to be dissipating, revealing the soft glow of streetlights far below, but then he noticed something new, a thin vertical distortion in the glass, subtle yet unmistakable, as if the pane were being stretched from the outside by a weightless force, causing the reflections to bend inward in a way that suggested proximity without form. His heartbeat thudded unevenly in his chest, and the urge to escape overwhelmed every other instinct. He imagined himself bolting for the hallway, pounding on a neighbor's door, begging someone to tell him that he wasn't losing his mind, yet he feared that opening the front door might collapse the delicate barrier that still existed between him and whatever waited behind the distortion on the window. He reached for his phone on the floor, his fingers trembling, and as he lifted it, he noticed the screen lighting again with another alert. Motion detected, 30 meters, except this time, the attached thumbnail showed not the window, but the hallway outside his apartment, captured from the building's overhead CCTV. And in the low-resolution frame was a tall, coat-like blur positioned exactly at the far end of the hall, just visible near the dim glow of the emergency exit sign. The image seemed to flicker before his eyes, as if resisting being fully seen, and as he stared, he sensed that the thing was not approaching in any physical way, but rather adjusting itself along the same impossible tether that had governed its earlier movements, aligning the distance with a precision that made his blood run cold. He lowered the phone slowly and turned his head toward the apartment door, feeling his pulse thudding against his neck, and the dim outline of the deadbolt and chain lock seemed suddenly fragile in the faint ambient light, inadequate against something that did not behave like a person or a presence bound by walls. He stepped toward the door anyway, driven by a desperate need to confirm that there was nothing on the other side. But before he reached it, a soft shift in the air behind him made him freeze. It was subtle, nearly imperceptible, like the displacement of warmth when someone walks past you in a crowded hallway, except there was no one else in the room, no movement except his own trembling breaths. He felt the hairs along his arms lift in a slow, creeping wave. He turned his head by degrees, unable to fully commit to facing the window again, yet unable to look away entirely, and in the corner of his eye he saw that the vertical distortion had changed shape. It was now slightly bent, angled forward, as though something were leaning toward the glass from a vantage point that should have required a physical body, but somehow did not. The fog pulsed again. The lights in the street below flickered faintly. Ethan stumbled backward until he reached the kitchen counter, gripping the edge with both hands as though anchoring himself to something solid would prevent the impossible geometry of the moment from unraveling his sense of reality. He squeezed his eyes shut and tried to steady his breath, and in that darkness he remembered the faint brushing sensation he had felt in the skyway, the subtle sweep of something weightless grazing his sleeve, and the realization that the same movement could occur here, in his apartment, without any physical presence approaching him, made his stomach twist. When he opened his eyes again, he was met not with the window but with the hallway security feed blinking on his phone. Another motion ping, and the thumbnail now showed the blur closer, not by walking, not by progression, but by simple, disorienting relocation. It stood halfway down the hall, still maintaining the same precise orientation toward his apartment door, its form subtly elongated by the camera's grain, the coat-like silhouette rippling as though caught in a breeze that wasn't there. Ethan felt a sudden claustrophobia constricting the room, squeezing the air from his lungs, and he realized with a sickening clarity that his apartment was no longer a refuge but a container, a box being monitored from multiple angles by something that moved according to rules he could not understand. He backed farther into the room, feeling the wall meet his spine, and forced his eyes toward the window again, half expecting the silhouette to have vanished, half dreading that it hadn't, and what he saw made his breath fracture into silence. The window, once simply fogged, now bore a faint pattern on the inside surface, a delicate, almost symmetrical condensation trail, forming a shape he could not decipher at first, like a number or a sigil or a measurement, and as the realization settled in, he understood it was marking distance, some quiet, intentional calibration between him and the entity outside, a reminder that the space between them was not a boundary but a rule, and rules could be rewritten. The fog pulsed once more, and then, from behind the front door, so soft it blended with the hum of the refrigerator, came a rhythmic vibration, a slow, deliberate beat that resonated through the floorboards in a chilling, clock-like interval, as if the very structure of the apartment were being tested, measured, prepared. Ethan pressed a hand to his chest in a futile attempt to calm the tremor of his heartbeat, and in that moment he felt an overwhelming certainty that the thing stalking him did not want to breach the distance. It wanted him to understand it, to acknowledge the geometry it imposed, and the thought hollowed him out with a dread so pure he could barely remain standing. The tapping behind the door grew slightly louder, still measured, still impossibly patient, and Ethan realized he was no longer dealing with pursuit but with arrangement, with a presence that was shaping the space around him as easily as a draftsman draws lines on a blueprint, positioning itself with mathematical tenderness. As he stood trembling in the half-lit room, his eyes drifting in terrified cycles between the window, the door, and the phone spilling out motion alerts. He felt the distance tighten, not close, not closing, but tightening, as though the invisible tether that linked him to the thing had pulled one subtle notch shorter, and he understood with a dread that pierced bone that the entity was no longer outside, no longer in the hallway, no longer confined to any fixed coordinate. It was everywhere the distance allowed. It was inside the measurement. It was inside the rule, and the rule was changing. Ethan felt the apartment closing around him like a lung drawing its final breath, every surface carrying the tremble of a presence that was not inside the room in any physical sense, yet saturated every inch of it with an attention so focused it made the air taste metallic, and as the rhythmic tapping behind the door lengthened into a slow, deliberate sequence that echoed faintly through the frame, he realized with a sick clarity that the entity was no longer enforcing the same 30-meter rule as before, but was instead testing the elasticity of that distance, pressing it inward as though curious how tightly the measurement could wrap around a single human life. He moved through the apartment in small, disoriented steps, each one accompanied by the faintest reaction, an almost imperceptible shift of fog on the window, a subtle tightening of the pattern etched there, a soft vibration in the floorboards beneath his feet, and he understood then that every movement he made was being answered, not mirrored but measured, as if the entity were mapping him in real time, adjusting its position along an invisible grid that obeyed laws no human geometry had ever articulated. He thought of running into the hallway, but the memory of the CCTV image, the coat-like silhouette waiting in stillness, positioned as though drawn with a ruler at the far end, stopped him cold. Even if he fled down the stairs, even if he escaped into the street, he knew he would eventually feel that same quiet recalibration behind him, the presence slipping effortlessly back into its perfect interval. The realization hollowed him with a dread so deep it numbed his fingertips. He had mistaken the distance for a limit, when in truth it was a condition, a rule that only held because he had not yet done the thing that would allow it to break. The apartment seemed to pulse with that understanding, the lights dimming almost imperceptibly, as if sinking beneath the weight of some slow gravitational pull. And when Ethan approached the window again, drawn by a mix of fear and compulsion, he saw that the earlier fog had formed into something sharper, cleaner, almost deliberate, a symbol or diagram etched in breath and condensation, 3 vertical strokes and 2 horizontal ones, layered like a simple but ancient notation of space. He lifted his hand toward the glass without meaning to, his fingers rising in a slow, trembling arc, and as he drew closer, the pattern shifted, adjusting itself in response to the angle of his hand, aligning with him as though inviting completion. A faint vibration under his palm told him that the window was not acting as a barrier but as a membrane, thin and fragile, stretched to its limit by 2 corresponding forces, the inside and the outside, himself and the thing, and if he pressed just a millimeter closer, the surface would accept the contact as permission. Permission, he realized, was the missing element. The thing had followed the distance, not because it could not cross it, but because he had not yet signaled his acceptance of its presence, had not yet acknowledged the rule binding them, and as he stared into the symbol on the glass, its sharp strokes aligning perfectly with the spread of his fingers, he understood that the entity had not been pursuing him at all. It had been waiting for him to reach back. The soft creak behind him broke the moment, a gentle whisper of pressure against the front door as though someone were leaning their weight onto it from the hallway, and Ethan's breath faltered as he realized the tapping had stopped entirely, replaced now with a slow, steady pulse that resonated through the wood like the heartbeat of a clock winding toward its final measure. He backed away from the window, feeling the weight of an unseen gaze tracking him, tightening the distance as though drawing an invisible circle around him with each step he took. The apartment grew colder, the air thickening, until his breath emerged in pale, trembling clouds. The lights flickered, not chaotically, but in a rhythm that matched the slow pulse at the door. Ethan clutched the edge of the counter, trying to steady his spinning thoughts, and in that moment of near collapse, a memory surfaced, something small yet sharp, a detail he had forced from his mind during the chaotic run through the skyway. When he had paused near the maintenance alcove, just before the door refused to open, he had seen faint grooves in the linoleum floor, not scratches made by feet or equipment, but long, parallel indentations spaced evenly apart, scar lines carved by something repeatedly dragged or positioned with precise distance. The grooves had pointed toward him, as though marking a path the entity had rehearsed endlessly, testing how far it could reach without breaking its rule. The pattern on the window, the figure in the hallway, the fog blooming exactly where his breath did not reach it, all formed the same message. The distance was not chasing him, it was shaping him. His apartment suddenly felt smaller, the angles sharper, the shadows deeper, each corner holding the suggestion of a presence waiting for acknowledgement. He staggered toward the sofa, dropping onto it with a heaviness that made the cushions wheeze beneath him, and pressed his palms to his temples, trying to understand what the entity wanted. The answer came not in words, but in geometry. The 30 meters were not an accident, they were a threshold, the minimum space needed for the thing to exist without collapsing into him. If he breached it willingly, accidentally, or through some gesture the entity interpreted as consent, the shape behind the distance would shift from observer to occupant. The room dimmed further, not ominously, but with the slow, absolute confidence of something drawing closer without moving. Ethan's phone vibrated again, rolling slightly on the floor where he had dropped it earlier, and he forced himself to pick it up, though every instinct screamed not to see what new motion alert had arrived. The screen pulsed with a live feed from the hallway, and Ethan's hands shook so violently he almost dropped the phone. The silhouette, once positioned at the far end, now stood directly in front of his apartment door, not by any act of movement, but by a simple recalibration of space, as though it had rewritten its own coordinates to skirt the boundary of the rule. The shape was clearer now, tall and impossibly narrow, the suggestion of a coat suspended without a body, its hem trembling in some invisible current, and although the camera could not capture its details, the space around it seemed subtly indented, as though reality bent inward at the edges. Ethan's breath fractured as he lowered the phone. The pulse behind the door grew softer, slower, a patient invitation. The entity was waiting, the final line drawn, the final note measured. It would not enter. It would be allowed. Ethan stepped backward until he reached the window again, not out of intention, but because the geometry of the apartment seemed to funnel him toward it, and when his fingers brushed the glass, the symbol of condensation aligned itself perfectly with the outline of his hand, the vertical strokes merging with his fingers in an almost magnetic attraction. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the fog pulsed in a gentle, almost welcoming expansion, and he understood with a terrible clarity that this was the signal. This was the breach. This was the permission the thing had waited for since the very first moment he had stepped into the skyway. The door behind him fell silent. The apartment fell silent. Even his breath fell silent. And from the window, from the symbol, from the soft trembling in the air, came a quiet shift, like a footstep taken without sound, and Ethan felt the distance collapse, not violently, not abruptly, but with a slow, inevitable grace, as if 2 points on a map had simply decided they no longer needed space between them. The last thought that flickered through his mind before everything folded inward was not fear, nor defiance, but a single chilling certainty. The thing had never been chasing him. It had been teaching him how to meet it halfway. Crimson Cure. Agent Novak had grown accustomed to the sterile, almost timeless atmosphere of the unit, though accustomed was hardly the right word for the way the underground facility hollowed out one's sense of self. The temperature never shifted, and the white lights never dimmed, turning every hour into a seamless continuation of the last. In the corridors, the floor tiles were polished to such an impossible gleam that Novak often saw his own reflection travel beneath him like an echo trying to keep up. Long before the serum, he had been a man who understood limits. He knew where pain began, where tissue failed, where instinct warned him to slow down or step back. But after the injection, after the red, humming fluid disappeared into his veins as if it had always belonged there, he moved with a strange awareness that his body was no longer a fixed entity. The monitors in the labs beeped and hummed like mechanical heartbeats, tracking his biology with cold precision. And Novak sometimes wondered whether they were observing recovery or documenting a slow, deliberate unmaking. His wounds healed too quickly now. Cuts, sealed before blood could fall, Bruises dissolved into pale skin within minutes. Yet what unsettled him most was not the speed, but the sense that each healing came with an adjustment, a correction, a silent negotiation between him and something deeper in his tissues, as if his cells were no longer repairing, they were reorganizing. That morning's collision test revealed the first undeniable deviation from anything Dr. Anya had predicted. The simulation rig malfunctioned, dropping a metal frame directly onto Novak's left shoulder with enough force to shatter bone. He heard the crack, felt it in the air rather than in pain, and then sensed a shifting beneath the skin, a slithering coalescence of fibers knitting in new patterns. When he touched the area, the flesh was warm and moving, almost as if something just beneath the surface were pushing upward to meet his hand. As the shoulder reformed, he saw beneath the translucent, tightening skin a network of red filaments, branching out like roots, seeking purchase in new soil, glowing faintly in the clinical light. They spiraled, they tightened, and then, just as quickly, they sank deeper, leaving behind a faint marbling of crimson beneath the skin, neither bruise nor scar, but something stable, deliberate, almost territorial, behind the observation glass. Doctor. Anya recorded the entire sequence with the calm of someone watching a predictable chemical reaction, claiming that such transition structures were common during accelerated cellular regeneration, and that the crimson root-like growths were merely stem cells, forming temporary scaffolds. Novak wanted to believe her, to trust that the shifting patterns under his skin were just a side effect. But the sensation, the pulse-like throb of something not entirely his, lingered long after the injury had vanished. The body healed, yes, and beautifully, but the process had not felt like healing. It had felt like something learning. He returned to his assigned quarters afterward, a rectangular steel compartment that barely qualified as a living space and even less as a sanctuary, and lay on the narrow cot, staring at the pale ceiling while the red threads under his skin glimmered and faded with each slow breath. The absence of pain, once a marvel, had become disorienting. Without pain, he could no longer tell where he ended and the world began. He pressed a palm against the cold steel wall and felt the crimson filaments in his arm respond faintly, as though tuning themselves to the temperature or the density of the metal. Novak realized, with a creeping chill, that his body was not merely healing from the impact. It was sampling it, memorizing it, adapting. The unit liked to speak of evolution as a series of gains, but he sensed an inversion taking place. Instead of enhancing human resilience, the serum was blurring boundaries, erasing the distinctions that kept a human body separate from its surroundings. The quiet in his room was absolute except for one sound, barely perceptible yet unmistakable once he heard it. A soft, stretching whisper beneath his skin, like bark splitting softly as something grows just beneath the surface. He had once believed immortality meant the preservation of self. Now, lying rigid in the dim, humming quiet of the underground chamber, he understood it might mean surrendering the self entirely, and whatever was growing inside him was already rehearsing the shape it wanted to take next. In the days following the collision test, Novak found himself slipping into a peculiar state of hyper-awareness, not of danger or surroundings, as any trained operative might, but of his own interior landscape, as though each breath carried an echo from some deeper chamber of his body where the serum had seeded new logic. The facility moved around him in a constant orchestration of mechanical sighs and filtered air, the corridors humming with the relentless pulse of machines that never slept, and Novak's footsteps, once solid and familiar, now seemed to belong to a body that walked slightly ahead or slightly behind his mind. During training drills, where impacts were part of the curriculum, he began noticing changes that no data sheet had prepared him for. When he scraped his forearm along the edge of a reinforced shield, the skin did not simply knit together, but rippled outward in a way that felt exploratory, as if the tissues were assessing the surface they touched. When he strained his muscles during weighted maneuvers, the fibers tightened with such unnatural elasticity that he felt them humming beneath the skin long after the exercise had ended. Even the air felt different against him, brushing across his skin not as temperature or pressure but as information. He tried to dismiss these observations as paranoia, an overactive mind trapped too long in sterile corridors and clinical light. But during one particular drill, a controlled explosion meant to measure shock absorption, he felt something uncoil beneath his ribs, just moments before the blast wave hit, a reflex so alien and precise that he instinctively knew it was not his own. The shock tore across his torso with force that should have fractured bone and ruptured organs. Yet instead of pain, Novak felt a deep thrumming bloom through his abdomen, spreading outward like heat from a furnace vent, and then the impossible sensation of threads knitting, spiraling, anchoring themselves to the bruised tissue with a hunger that had nothing to do with healing. When he lifted his shirt afterward in the privacy of the decontamination chamber, he saw crimson veins branching under the skin in slow serpentine arcs, edges shimmering like wet roots exposed to open air, the pattern pulsing faintly as though communicating with something unseen. Dr. Anya insisted on additional scans after the blast test, guiding Novak into the imaging chamber where the air vibrated with low electromagnetic hums that made his teeth ache slightly. She watched the monitors while the machines circled him with cold precision, their beams passing through his tissue in long, meticulous sweeps, and Novak tried to steady his breathing as the red filaments under his skin tightened in response to the electromagnetic field. He could feel them, not painfully, but undeniably contracting and unfurling in rhythmic waves, as though the serum had woven him into a living instrument tuned to frequencies he was never meant to sense. When the scan completed, Dr. Anya stepped away from the console with an expression Novak could only describe as delicate restraint, a practiced neutrality that looked more like fear disguised as thoughtfulness. She explained that the regenerative structures were becoming more efficient, a phrase she wielded with scientific clarity, but her voice faltered ever so slightly when she observed that the filaments were no longer confined to injury sites. They were beginning to appear spontaneously along connective tissues, tracing paths that made no anatomical sense. Novak asked if this was expected, and she replied with an elegance of tone that belied her hesitation, saying that biological systems sometimes developed adaptive redundancies under accelerated conditions. Yet as he dressed and prepared to leave, he caught a glimpse of the scan on her monitor, a snapshot of his torso overlaid with branching crimson structures that looked less like veins and more like a root system expanding confidently into its environment, reaching not for stability but for ownership. The air in the room felt suddenly too thin, and he had to remind himself to breathe, because the realization struck him with quiet finality. His body was not enhancing itself, it was rehearsing a pattern. That night, in the solitude of his quarters, Novak tried to sleep, but his body refused the stillness. Every surface that touched him seemed to provoke a subtle reaction. The sheets beneath his back warmed where he lay, and he could sense the faint stirring of those crimson fibers beneath the skin, as if they were aligning to the geometry of the mattress itself. He sat up, pressing his palms against his knees, trying to recenter his thoughts, but the more he focused on the sensation, the more clearly he felt the serum's influence threading through him not as a foreign substance but as a directive, a quiet, insistent purpose that had never belonged to him. He remembered how Dr. Anya had described the serum as a tool for healing, a catalyst to push the human body beyond its frailties, and he wondered if she had ever truly believed that, or if she had simply chosen a vocabulary that kept the truth contained. The regeneration no longer felt like recovery. It felt like acquisition. When he closed his eyes, he sensed the faint pulse of the red filaments spreading minutely with each breath, expanding in patterns that mirrored the rhythm of the ventilation system humming through the walls. He pressed a hand to his chest and felt nothing, no heartbeat, no warmth, just a subtle vibration beneath the skin that reminded him of a branch quivering under the weight of its own growth. In the dim light of his compartment, surrounded by the sterile hum of the unit, he understood at last that the serum had not gifted him with immortality. It had given him a body that no longer recognized the concept of damage, a body that sought to erase the distinction between itself and whatever it touched. And as the red filament stirred restlessly beneath his ribs, Novak felt with a heavy and irrevocable certainty that he had become something that did not simply heal, it reached. The mission that changed everything began as unremarkably as any field test that the unit disguised as routine deployment. Novak boarded the armored carrier with the same clinical detachment that had become second nature since the serum feeling the subtle hum of his altered physiology calibrating itself to the vibration of the engine beneath the metal flooring. Outside, the world was washed in dusk light, that ambiguous hour where the horizon dims into violet haze and every object seems to blur slightly at its edges, a quality of atmosphere that made Novak feel as though he were moving through a threshold rather than a landscape. The unit had sent him to intercept a rogue intelligence cell rumored to possess classified biotech, a task he could have completed effortlessly even before his transformation. Yet now, every movement he made during the approach felt like a negotiation between who he had been and what the serum was sculpting him into. His senses sharpened in peculiar ways. Distances stretched and compressed as though the air itself were malleable. Sound vibrated through his bones instead of his ears, and under his skin the crimson filaments stirred in long, languid waves, expanding with each breath as if preparing for something. By the time the carrier reached the perimeter of the abandoned complex, the mission site thick with shadows, broken windows, and the scent of oxidized metal, Novak felt both impossibly aware of his surroundings and strangely dissociated from them, as though he were moving through a diagram drawn in real time, one where the lines of architecture and flesh were equally negotiable. The explosion that tore through his body came without warning, a feedback-triggered detonation from a booby-trapped corridor that shattered concrete and hurled shrapnel with the violence of a collapsing star. For the briefest instant, Novak understood how a body should feel when bisected by steel and fire. He sensed the geometry of damage, the trajectory of each fragment, the void where breath should seize in agony, but no pain came. Instead, an immense silence blossomed through him, followed by a deep and resonant vibration, like the sound of a tree trunk splitting open under the weight of its own growth. He looked down and saw the impossible. His torso, sliced nearly apart, clinging together only by strands of wet, luminous tissue that pulsed with violent intention. The red filaments erupted from the wounds not as veins, but as reaching structures, branching outward with startling speed, anchoring themselves to the shattered concrete, the steel rebar, and even the dust-laden air, pulling whatever they touched into rapid reformation. Novak felt each connection as a tug within his own body, a gathering of foreign material pulled greedily into the architecture of his flesh. His bones knitted with a sound like twigs snapping underfoot, his organs reshaped with an elastic tremor, his skin closed over a lattice of organic and inorganic amalgam that did not feel like him at all. He stood within seconds, fully reformed, but altered, taller somehow, heavier in presence, and not because of mass, but because of a density in his very being, as though his body had borrowed something from the environment and now carried the weight of its rearranged geometry. As he stepped into the ruined hallway, his voice emerged distorted, not with pain or struggle, but with a layered resonance that carried hints of cracking wood and grinding stone, as if the act of healing had imprinted new textures upon his vocal cords. The mission site became a proving ground for a transformation that no human algorithm could have predicted. Every injury, no matter how small, triggered the same ravenous response. The crimson filaments burst through the skin like living sutures, latching onto whatever surface stood nearest, drawing strength and structure from it with an instinctive intelligence that made Novak feel as though his body were thinking for itself. A graze against a metal beam produced a shimmer of silver beneath his skin. A fall against old flooring left ceramic flecks embedded into his palms, not as debris, but as integrated architecture. The serum was no longer healing him, it was harvesting. By the time Novak completed the mission, the rogue cell incapacitated almost effortlessly. He moved through the compound with a presence that felt neither human nor monstrous, but something in between, as though he were a walking negotiation between organic tissue and the world that pressed against it. When he finally caught his reflection in a cracked glass pane, he barely recognized the figure staring back. Faint red lines traced beneath the surface of his skin in intricate branching networks, glowing subtly with each breath, and his eyes, once sharp and rational, now held a depth that felt layered, as if he were looking out from behind several selves, each one shaped by the fragments he had absorbed. He touched the glass, and the reflection trembled, not from movement, but from the faint vibration of the filaments beneath his fingertips, and in that moment he understood with cold clarity that the serum had not removed his ability to feel pain. It had replaced it with hunger. A body that could not break had become a body that refused to remain itself. By the time Novak staggered back into the subterranean corridors of the unit, the facility's familiar sterility felt warped in a way that made him question whether he was observing the environment or projecting some new, intrusive instinct onto it. The air was too still, too dense, and every fluorescent light overhead seemed to hum with a pitch slightly out of human range, vibrating through the red lattice beneath his skin as if the filaments were tuning themselves to an invisible frequency carried through the concrete. He walked with the careful, deliberate movements of someone wearing a body they had not yet grown accustomed to, and as he passed through the scanner gate leading to the medical wing, the machine emitted a wavering distortion instead of its usual crisp chime, to a glitch so subtle that only someone with heightened perception would have noticed. Novak felt the reverberation along his spine, the filaments beneath his skin tightening in response, as though they recognized the disruption not as a malfunction but as a signal. The world around him seemed too malleable, too ready to adjust to his presence, and even the polished floors reflected his silhouette with a sluggish afterimage, like a shadow trying to detach itself. Doctor. Anya appeared long before he heard her approaching, her figure framed by the sterile glow of the lab entrance, and for a moment Novak wondered whether she saw the same distortion he felt radiating from his bones. Her face held the clinical composure she had worn since the earliest days of the project, but he sensed a tension beneath it, a careful bracing against whatever version of him she expected to step forward. The red filaments shifted restlessly under his skin, responding to her proximity not with aggression but with a strange anticipatory awareness, and he realized that his body had begun to catalog people the same way it cataloged materials, mapping them, measuring them, preparing for possibilities he did not dare contemplate. Inside the medical observation chamber, Novak stood on the scanning platform while Dr. Anya initiated a battery of diagnostics. The machines emitted layered sounds, ultrasonic pulses, electromagnetic hums, the clicking rotations of internal imaging arrays, and each vibration seemed to resonate through him in increasingly intricate ways, as though the filaments interpreted the frequencies as invitations rather than probes. He remained still, but his body did not. Beneath the skin, he felt shifting textures, subtle rearrangements, as if the architecture of his tissues were debating new instructions with every wave of energy that passed through them. Doctor. Anya watched the monitors with an expression that had evolved far beyond scientific curiosity. The readings displayed structures that pulsed with crimson intensity, networks that extended into regions where no regenerative scaffolding should exist. She zoomed in on one cross-section, and Novak caught a glimpse of the image, a branching root-like formation that seemed to have wrapped itself around his ribcage, merging bone with a delicate, crystalline matrix. She spoke softly, attempting reassurance, yet the tremor in her voice betrayed a truth she did not articulate. The serum had not merely accelerated healing, it had removed the conceptual barrier between Novak and the environment, allowing his biology to adopt anything that offered structural advantage. He remembered the concrete and steel he had absorbed during the explosion, the way the filaments had reached outward instead of inward, and a cold clarity settled into his mind as he understood that his survival in the field had not been recovery, but assimilation. Doctor. Anya's gaze flickered toward him with the kind of fragile concern one might offer a creature caught between forms, and in that moment Novak sensed her struggling to reconcile the man she had guided through the project with the entity now standing before her. He wondered whether she feared for him or for the world that might touch him next. The session concluded, but the unease within Novak only deepened as he returned to his personal chamber. The walls felt closer now, their perfectly linear geometry pressing against the expanding instinct of his altered biology. Each surface he brushed seemed to soften imperceptibly beneath his fingertips, not physically but perceptually, as though the distance between matter and meaning were thinning at the edges. He sat on the edge of the cot, grounding himself with slow, even breaths, yet each exhale felt foreign, as if the air inside him had been filtered through a living lattice that shaped it before release. He lifted his hands, studying the faint crimson lines tracing beneath the skin, noticing how they pulsed with a slow, contemplative rhythm, almost as though they were waiting for an instruction he could not decipher. A faint tremor spread through him, not painful but deeply unsettling, a vibration that originated somewhere near his spine and radiated outward, blurring the distinction between his heartbeat and the ambient thrum of the facility. He pressed his palms against his temples, trying to steady the flood of sensations. But the moment he closed his eyes, he saw the explosion again, not the violence of it, but the moment of reconstruction, the branching filaments reaching outward like roots, tasting the soil after a long drought. He felt a swell of nausea, not because of the memory, but because part of him recognized the sensation not as horror, but as hunger, a calling that had been awakened and could not be undone. The truth that settled into him was not dramatic or sudden. It arrived gently, like a needle slipping beneath the skin. The serum had not given him a form, it had given him strategies. The body that could not break no longer understood the purpose of remaining singular. As the overhead lights flickered slightly, casting elongated shadows across the steel walls, Novak felt the red filaments pulse with a slow, resonant echo, as though acknowledging the space around them with a readiness that frightened him in a way pain never had. For the first time since the serum, he wished desperately to feel something as simple and human as fear anchored in flesh, rather than this expanding horizon of instinct that whispered of growth without boundary. Long before the unit's alarms began screaming through the subterranean wings of the facility, Novak sensed the shift not as a sound, nor as a tremor, but as a deep, internal folding, a subtle but decisive reorientation of everything beneath his skin. He had been pacing the narrow length of his chamber, trying to occupy his mind with something other than the restless pulsing of the crimson filaments coiling along his ribs, when a peculiar warmth began spreading outward from the center of his chest. It was not heat in the human sense. It felt more like the soft radiance of a growing organism, something stirring beneath layers of tissue like a seed preparing to break open. Novak paused and pressed a hand to his sternum. Then for a moment the warmth receded as though acknowledging him. But then it surged again in a quiet, unstoppable tide. His breath hitched, not from pain because his body had forgotten what pain was, but from the overwhelming sense that something inside him had made a decision entirely without him. He felt the filaments tighten and then fan outward along his limbs, weaving new patterns that shimmered beneath the surface like veins filling with liquid light. The world around him sharpened in strange ways. The hum of ventilation ducts grew into a layered chorus of mechanical heartbeats. The metallic scent of the air intensified until he could distinguish the trace minerals in the recycled oxygen, and even the walls themselves seemed to sway slightly, as though responding to the subtle vibrations emerging from his body. When the containment sirens finally erupted, their pitch slicing through the stale air, Novak realized they were not responding to an external breach, they were responding to him. Dr. Anya arrived, flanked by two soldiers, their protective suits reflecting the sterile brightness of the hallway lights. But Novak could see the tremor in their posture even before they stepped into his chamber. He remained seated on the cot, trying to still the pulsing beneath his skin. Yet the filaments continued to flare in slow, deliberate rhythms, expanding along his arms and chest like organic circuitry, attempting to map its surroundings. As Dr. Anya approached, the filaments responded to her presence with a faint shimmer, as though recognizing her voice, her scent, her role in their creation. She spoke to him in a steady tone crafted from scientific composure, but beneath it he heard the trembling of someone facing a truth she had tried to outrun. She explained, not as confession but as capitulation, that the serum had crossed a threshold they had never anticipated. Its regenerative properties had begun dissolving the conceptual barrier between Novak and his environment, allowing his body to incorporate foreign matter not as repair but as expansion. He understood then that the mission explosion had not merely injured him, it had offered his altered physiology the perfect opportunity to reveal its true capacity. The filaments were no longer tools for preservation. They were tendrils of a system seeking form, guidance, and contact, and Novak felt each subtle wave of motion inside him with a clarity that bordered on telepathy. He tried to steady himself, to anchor his thoughts in the memory of who he once was, but when he looked down, he saw the skin along his forearms shifting, not tearing or breaking, but softening into translucent sheen as if preparing to release new structures beneath. The soldiers stepped back, and Novak could feel their fear radiating through the air as vividly as heat. The chamber lights flickered, as though straining under the presence of something that was no longer a single organism but a negotiation of countless potentials. The decision to isolate him came quickly, driven less by protocol than by the unspoken desperation of those who finally understood that the cure they engineered had outgrown its container. Novak was escorted, though, and escorted felt like the wrong word, as he moved with a fluid calm that required no restraint down a corridor that seemed to shrink around him, the walls echoing every faint vibration of the filaments pulsing beneath his skin. By the time they reached the isolation bay, the filaments had breached the surface in delicate, root-like strands that glistened in the sterile light before retracting back into his flesh, as if testing the environment for material compatibility. The glass chamber waiting for him was reinforced, seamless, and sealed from every angle, a design that suggested more fear than foresight. As he entered, Novak felt a peculiar resistance from the air itself, a subtle pushback that reminded him of walking into a space that had never been meant for anything living. He placed his hand against the inner wall, not intentionally, not with aggression, but with a quiet, instinctive reach, and the glass trembled beneath his touch, not cracking or bending, but reacting, as though it recognized the presence of something capable of rewriting it. "Doctor," Anya shouted for him to withdraw his hand, but even through the intercom her voice sounded distant, swallowed by the dense hum that filled his chest. He tried to speak, to reassure her, to reassure himself, yet the sound that emerged from his throat was layered with the faint, brittle crack of splintering wood and the hollow echo of shifting earth, as though his voice had begun borrowing textures from the materials he had absorbed. His final words, "he needed healing," came out half human, half something that had forgotten the value of boundaries. "Doctor." Anya's last command echoed through the containment bay like a verdict carved into metal. No one was to let him touch anything again, but Novak's hand remained suspended in the air between them, trembling slightly, not in fear or pain, but in longing, a quiet biological imperative searching for structure, connection, permission. Inside the sealed chamber, the filaments beneath his skin pulsed with a soft crimson light, and the glass wall quivered in reply, as though understanding that the distance between healing and consuming had collapsed into a single, irreversible definition. And as the isolation seals locked into place, Novak felt the final truth settle into him with a slow, devastating clarity. The serum had not made him immortal. It had made him incomplete unless he continued to merge, absorb, and assimilate, forever reaching toward the world with a hunger his body interpreted only as survival. The Chronos tally. Eliza had always believed that working the night shift in an old hospital came with a unique kind of stillness, the sort of silence that pressed lightly against the skin rather than the ears, as if the darkness of the corridors had become a living, breathing presence that moved only when no one watched. On nights like this, when the winter wind scraped against the windows and the fluorescent lights hummed with an uneven, moth-eaten glow, she felt the building age around her in small, patient increments, the same way human bones do, quietly, inevitably, without needing permission. The hospital had been built almost a century earlier, a labyrinth of narrow hallways and outdated equipment that might have been retired long ago if not for its peculiar legacy. Every 4 years, on the night before February 29th, it held a small celebration for those rare souls born on Leap Day. The staff treated it as a harmless tradition, something quirky to mention on evening rounds, but Eliza had always felt a deeper weight behind it, a sense that the old building remembered more than the people who worked in it. She'd been born on a leap day herself and was therefore expected to attend these gatherings, though she never quite understood why her presence mattered so much to the few elderly survivors who still returned for the ceremony. The soft rattle of a cart's wheels echoed somewhere down the hall, and she looked up from her clipboard, feeling the familiar pull of time behaving strangely in this place, sliding, stretching, bending around corners like something with purpose rather than indifference. Tonight's celebration was unlike any she had attended before, though she couldn't put her finger on what made it feel so profoundly different until she stepped into the small common room reserved for the event. There were no decorations beyond a modest banner the volunteers reused every 4 years, and the punch bowl sat untouched on the table beside a tray of pastries that had begun to harden at the edges. Normally, by now, there would be a handful of elderly Leap Day patients chatting softly, exchanging stories about lives that seemed to age in 4-year increments. But the room was nearly empty. Only one person sat in the far corner, hunched beneath the flickering light of an old wall sconce. Mr. Smith, the hospital's oldest surviving leap-year baby and the only person still living from the first recorded celebration. His frailty seemed sharper tonight, as though the skin around his cheekbones had thinned into fragile paper, and his breath emerged in quiet, uneven threads that fogged slightly in the cold air. Eliza approached him with a gentle smile, feeling the weight of the moment settling around her like a curtain being drawn. She had known him since her internship, and though he rarely spoke more than a few sentences at a time, there was something about his gaze, steady, pale, and strangely calculating, that always made her feel as though he were counting something behind her eyes. When she greeted him, he raised one trembling hand and placed a leather-bound ledger into her palms, its surface cracked and softened by time, the pages within whispering faintly as though disturbed by her touch. The book felt impossibly cold, colder than the room, colder than Mr. Smith's hand, and she sensed instantly that whatever it recorded had not been meant for casual reading. She opened the ledger only slightly, just enough to glimpse the edges of handwritten names and dates arranged in neat, unwavering columns, each line written in dark ink that had barely faded despite the age of the parchment. The moment her finger brushed one of the entries, a sensation like static electricity ran up her arm, subtle but unmistakable, as if the ink itself carried some residual memory that still clung to it. Mr. Smith watched her reaction with an expression that hovered somewhere between relief and resignation, and the tick of the old grandfather clock in the corner began to align with his shallow breaths in a way that made the air feel too synchronized to be natural. It occurred to her then that she could not remember the last time someone new had joined the leap year celebration. The group had dwindled steadily over the decades, but no one spoke of the dwindling as anything unusual, as though their absence had been smoothed over by the passage of time itself. She sensed, with a quiet shiver beneath her ribs, that this ledger held an explanation, one both older and heavier than the hospital's walls. As she held the book against her chest, she felt the faintest pulse beneath the leather cover, a rhythmic throb not unlike a heartbeat, though slower, older, and calibrated to something deeper than human life. The clock in the corner struck another soft note, and Eliza had the strangest impression that it wasn't marking the hour but acknowledging her, as if some thread between her and the ledger had just been drawn taut. Eliza carried the ancient ledger down the dim hospital corridor with the kind of cautious reverence usually reserved for relics unearthed from burial sites, not books passed casually from the hand of an ailing patient to the hand of a night shift nurse. The leather binding felt heavier the longer she held it, as though each step she took added its own layer of weight, and the faint scent of aging parchment drifted upward in delicate threads, intertwining with the sterile smell of disinfectant that clung permanently to the air. The corridor lights flickered at irregular intervals, giving the illusion that she was walking through a sequence of slightly mismatched moments rather than a continuous hallway, and with every flicker the grandfather clock in the common room seemed to echo in her memory, its pendulum swinging at a rhythm she could still feel beneath her ribs. She found an empty staff lounge tucked near the old wing of the hospital, a place rarely used now except by the occasional intern seeking a quiet corner. The room held a stillness that did not belong to night shifts or abandoned spaces, but something older and expectant, kind of quiet, as though time itself were holding its breath. Eliza sat at the metal table beneath a weak, fluorescent light and opened the ledger carefully, letting the pages fall into place on their own. They settled upon an entry written in looping, meticulous handwriting, the ink dark and somehow glossy despite its age. She scanned the names, each accompanied by a birth date of February 29th, each paired with an age that seemed both precise and impossible. 72, 56, 64, 89, then suddenly 120, 134. She frowned in quiet confusion, tracing her fingertips across the ink as though the texture might explain the discrepancies, but the parchment felt smooth and unyielding beneath her touch. She flipped ahead and saw that the list continued, names she recognized from old celebration photographs, names she remembered hearing during previous gatherings, all marked with ages far beyond the typical human span. The ink grew more cramped as the years progressed, as though the writer had struggled to keep up with the accumulating entries. At the bottom of the page, separated from the rest. She found a final line bearing a name she knew intimately her own. It was written in the same elegant script, as though by a hand that had lived long enough to perfect the form of each stroke, and her breath caught when she saw that the space beside her name, designated for age, had been left blank. The room seemed to shift around her then, not with movement but with subtle realignment. The walls felt a little closer, the air a little heavier, and somewhere deep in the hospital structure she heard the faint rattle of a cart rolling along tile, though she knew no one else was working this particular hallway. The ledger's pages stirred lightly even though the air was still, and Eliza felt a strange, low vibration running through the book, something like the slow turning of gears buried deep beneath a floor she had never walked. She followed an instinct she did not fully understand and flipped to the oldest section of the ledger, the parchment thinning to the fragility of autumn leaves. The earliest entries described births from more than a century ago, but the detail that held her gaze was not the age of the ledger, it was the pattern forming across decades. Every 5 lines, a name had been struck through with a precise, almost surgical stroke. In the margin beside each crossed-out name was a number, smaller than the age but written with a decisiveness that unsettled her. At first she thought it represented the date of death, but the numbers were too consistent, too deliberately placed, always appearing after leap years. When she traced the pattern with her fingertip, she realized the truth in a quiet wave of dread. The number did not indicate death, but redistribution. Beneath each set of names, after each leap year period, the ages of the remaining individuals increased sharply, often doubling, sometimes tripling, as if they had inherited the time removed from the ledger by the stroke of the quill. As she flipped forward again, she noticed the pages tremble slightly under her touch, not fluttering as paper does, but shifting with intention, aligning themselves to a section she had not yet reached. It opened to a page where Mr. Smith's name appeared near the top, written in confident strokes, with an age that defied all medical reason. The number beside his most recent entry had been written only weeks ago, and it indicated a subtraction rather than an addition, a gentle erasure of years rather than their accumulation. Eliza felt her breath tighten as she understood he had not grown older this year. He had grown younger, at least on parchment, and the ledger recorded that change with eerie precision. The clock somewhere down the corridor struck a faint, resonant chime, but the sound carried an irregular cadence, as though struggling to keep time with something much older than its own mechanics. She sat back in her chair, the ledger opened before her like an artifact demanding interpretation, and a slow, chilly realization began to thread itself through her thoughts with the deliberate patience of ink soaking into parchment. It occurred to her that this tradition, this quaint hospital ritual of celebrating leap year births, was not a harmless superstition but part of a structure far older than the building itself, maintained by a ledger older than both. She tried to steady her breathing, but her chest felt tight, as though the air around her had thickened into something laden with meaning. As she stared at the blank space beside her name, she experienced a peculiar sensation, not fear exactly, but recognition, a dim and unsettled familiarity that made her skin prickle beneath her uniform. She suddenly remembered a conversation from her childhood, her grandmother telling her that being born on February 29th meant living differently, aging differently, carrying a peculiar relationship with time that others could not understand. She had dismissed it as folklore, something whispered to children to make an unusual birthday seem mystical rather than inconvenient. But here, in the sterile isolation of the hospital lounge, holding a ledger that pulsed faintly beneath her fingers, the old story no longer felt whimsical. It felt like a warning. She heard the soft echo of footsteps from the hallway, slow and dragging, as though someone were walking with great effort. An instinct told her it was Mr. Smith. But the steps lacked the rhythm of a living man. They sounded like echoes preserved inside walls, footprints left in time rather than on linoleum. The ledger's ink shimmered faintly, catching the stale fluorescent light in a way that made it appear wet, though her fingers remained dry. She closed the book with deliberate, trembling care, and even with the cover shut, she could still feel the soft pulse beneath her palms, as though the ledger was breathing with quiet patience, waiting for her to acknowledge the role she had inherited simply by being born on a day that time itself rarely offered. The pendulum of the clock in the common room swung faster now, its rhythm sharp and unnatural, marking not the passing of seconds but the approach of something inevitable. Eliza closed the ledger only halfway before she felt a shift in the air, a subtle realignment that did not resemble movement but rather the sensation of a large room exhaling after holding its breath for too long. The overhead light dimmed, not in intensity but in confidence, as though its brightness were being measured against something older and quieter, and she sensed the clock at the end of the hallway adjusting its tempo to match the new rhythm settling around her. When she stepped out of the lounge, carrying the ledger against her chest like a fragile but necessary burden, the corridor felt stretched, its length subtly distorted as if time itself had brushed a thumb along its frame, softening its edges. She walked slowly, feeling an ancient heaviness in her limbs, the kind that did not originate in muscle or bone, but in a kind of inherited memory passed down through generations of leap-year births, waiting patiently for its moment of recognition. The dust motes drifting in the hallway seemed suspended for a fraction too long before falling, and even her footsteps felt strangely out of sync with the ambient hum of the hospital. When she reached the corner leading to the common room, she stopped not because she saw anything unusual, but because she sensed something waiting beyond the doorway, something that had been patient for many years and was no longer content to remain silent. She stepped inside and found Mr. Smith standing, not seated, not slumped, but standing beside the grandfather clock, his posture straightened in a way she had never witnessed before, his frail body aligned so precisely with the swinging pendulum that he seemed almost to be mirroring it. His eyes found hers immediately, and though his face was still lined with age and exhaustion, there was a clarity in his gaze that did not belong to the elderly. It was the clarity of someone who remembered too much, who had lived through the accumulation of years that did not rightfully belong to him, who had been forced to carry a balance of time that pressed upon the soul as much as the body. Eliza's breath wavered in her chest as she approached him, the ledger trembling slightly under her grip, and she realized the trembling was not from her hands but from the book itself, as though it felt the presence of the man who had written so much of its history through his mere survival. Mr. Smith's breathing was shallow but rhythmic, each inhale matching the swing of the pendulum, each exhale aligning with the faint creak of aged wood in the grandfather clock's housing. The room had grown colder since she last stood there, not with the sharpness of winter air, but with the slow, deliberate chill of something ancient reclaiming its territory. Eliza felt time bending around them, compressing and expanding in small, uneven pulses, like a heartbeat struggling to regulate itself. She had seen patients near death before. She had held hands gone cold, closed eyes that would never open again, comforted families who needed a final moment of peace. But she had never seen a man poised at the threshold between life and something deeper, something that involved numbers, years, and the unseen ledger that every leap-year child seemed unknowingly bound to. When she stood before him, Mr. Smith raised one trembling hand, not to touch her, but to gesture toward the ledger pressed against her chest. The faint light from the sconce glinted off its worn leather surface, and she felt a pressure building in the room, as though time itself were leaning in to observe the moment. When she opened the ledger to the page bearing his most recent entry, the ink shimmered faintly, and she watched as the number beside his name, the age he should have been, flickered and wavered, the digits bending like metal softened by heat. The edges of the ink began to dissolve, each stroke thinning, unraveling into delicate threads that drifted upward before disappearing completely. She felt an ache behind her ribs, a sense that she was witnessing an extraction rather than an erasure, and when she lifted her eyes to Mr. Smith, she saw that something within him had begun to unravel in the same quiet, inevitable way. His shoulders sagged, his skin seemed to loosen along his jawline, and his breath, once synchronized with the clock, fell out of rhythm, as though he no longer had the strength to match its pace. The room filled with a soft, papery sound, the sound of parchment being torn delicately down its spine, and Eliza realized it was his breathing, thinning into something dry and brittle, like a flame burning low in its final moments. He did not collapse. He did not fall. Instead, he seemed to exhale one final time, with a slow, resigned surrender that carried the weight of more than a century, and as the breath left him, his form loosened into a drifting constellation of dust. It rose gently in the air, illuminated by the weak fluorescent light, each particle shimmering as though it carried the faint imprint of every stolen year he had lived. The dust did not scatter. It arranged itself around him in a quiet spiral that echoed the inked pattern of names and numbers within the ledger, and then it settled slowly onto the floor. Eliza's throat tightened as she felt a sudden heaviness settle over her shoulders, a subtle but undeniable shifting within the ledger's pages. She looked down and saw that her own entry, once blank beside the name, now bore a number that pulsed faintly in the parchment like a fresh wound, an age far beyond her own. The ink shimmered with a richness that felt alive, and beneath her skin she felt something tighten, not painfully, but with the undeniable weight of inheritance. Her joints ached suddenly, as though pressed upon by invisible years, and when she instinctively lifted her hand to her cheek, her fingertips found a faint line, a wrinkle that had not been there an hour ago. The clock behind her struck a new rhythm, faster than before, and the pendulum swung with a sharp, impatient click, its motion no longer steady but insistent. She heard her own breath change, shifting from the soft exhale of a young woman into something heavier, something worn, something that belonged to a body learning how to carry more time than it had lived. As she stared into the darkened window by the clock, her reflection wavered, the edges bending as though time were folding around her image, and in that fragile distortion she saw what Mr. Smith had once seen, a future measured not in years lived, but in years inherited, carried, and eventually surrendered. The ledger grew warm under her touch, as though acknowledging her place within its pages, and she realized with growing dread that tonight was not a celebration but a recalibration. This hospital had never been a gathering place for leap year births. It had been a transfer station, and she had just received her first allocation. Eliza remained standing in the empty common room long after Mr. Smith dissolved into particles, drifting like old paper ash, each speck shimmering faintly before disappearing into the corners of the room as though slipping back into the cracks of the hospital that had housed him for so many borrowed years. The grandfather clock beside her continued its impatient ticking, but the rhythm was no longer tethered to the steady, predictable measure of seconds. It lurched and surged, faltering just before catching itself again, the pendulum swinging in uneven arcs that made her uncertain whether it was keeping time or shedding it. She held the ledger close to her chest, feeling its unnatural warmth radiating through the leather cover, and the weight of it seemed to grow heavier each time she drew breath, as though the book were adjusting itself to match the expanding sum of years suddenly folded into her body. She walked toward the window overlooking the courtyard, intending to steady herself with the familiar sight of the old fountain outside, but even the world beyond the glass felt altered, its outlines softened and elongated as though she were looking through water rather than air. The courtyard lamps flickered with a strange afterglow, their halos stretched into elliptical rings that pulsed quietly, and the shadows cast by the benches and bare trees vibrated subtly, not with wind but with the tremor of time passing unevenly. Eliza felt her pulse shift into a slower rhythm, each beat resonating with an aged heaviness that did not match the body she had woken in that morning. Her joints ached faintly, her breath carried a rasp along the edges, and she sensed an unsettling truth rising like mist through her thoughts. She was no longer aging in seconds or hours, but in leaps, as though the years accumulating in the ledger were seeping into her with every heartbeat, recalibrating her to a different chronology. She pressed her palm against the window and watched the faint outline of her reflection ripple across the glass, the features subtly older, the eyes holding a shadow of fatigue she had not earned. It felt as though time, having been forced from Mr. Smith's body in a single, final exhalation, now pooled around her like a tide seeking a new shore. The hospital seemed to sense the shift within her, reacting the way old buildings sometimes do when the atmosphere changes, not in dramatic collapses or flickering lights, but in small, intimate gestures that reveal a deeper awareness. The floor beneath her feet carried a faint vibration, not mechanical, but organic, as though the very foundation of the hospital were adjusting its understanding of where she belonged in its long chronology. The hallway outside the common room appeared subtly elongated when she stepped into it, the distance between each overhead light feeling not spatial but temporal, She sensed that walking through the corridor meant crossing through pockets of slow and fast time, areas where the air thickened like syrup, and others where a draft of cool air rushed past as if collapsing centuries into a single breath. As she made her way toward the staircase that led to the older wing, she became acutely aware of the ledger in her hands, its pages shifting faintly as though reacting to the passing of each doorway. She felt a low thrumming from within, an ancient mechanism turning, recalculating, rewriting the balance of years it now carried. When she brushed her fingertips along the edge of the cover, she felt the faint imprint of a name rising beneath the leather, a name that had not been there before, and when she held the book closer to the hallway's weak light, she recognized the subtle indentation spelling out Eliza Ward on the front. Her name etched into the ledger not as ink but as structure, woven into the very fibers of the binding. She turned away in quiet horror, refusing to imagine what it meant for her identity to be absorbed by a book that had already survived more than a century of keeping accounts. The staircase groaned beneath her weight, not in protest but in acknowledgement, and she was seized by a sense that every surface in the building had begun measuring her, recording her, as though the hospital itself had become an extension of the ledger's patient arithmetic. The old wheel of the service cart at the end of the hallway rattled faintly without being touched, rolling an inch before stopping, and the sound echoed like an echo from a distant year attempting to align itself with the present. She wandered deeper into the old wing, not guided by logic, but by an instinct both foreign and intimately familiar, as though the years she now carried whispered directions through the blood pulsing in her temples. The air grew colder, sharper, as though the wing existed slightly out of phase with the rest of the hospital. She sensed moments layered atop one another like translucent slides, passing through her awareness with a faint pressure that felt like someone brushing her shoulder in another time. She entered an unused ward, its bed stripped of linens, the rusted wheels of unused equipment frozen mid-turn, and when she stepped fully inside, the sound of the clock from the common room came rushing back, louder now, distorted, as though it were ticking from within the walls. The ledger pulsed in her hands with a soft warmth that contrasted the chill in the air, and she realized, with sudden clarity, that she was standing in the wing where the very first leap year celebration had been held decades before. She felt the weight of history pressing against her, not as memory but as presence. When she opened the ledger again, the pages fluttered on their own, aligning themselves with a section she had not yet examined. She saw names she had never heard spoken aloud, some written in faded brown ink, others vibrant as though freshly inscribed, and she noticed the same pattern repeated across all the entries. After each leap year, one name was crossed out, and the remaining names increased in age by disproportionate amounts. Before she could study the handwriting further, the ink began to shift, the digits beside each name drifting slowly into new configurations, as though recalculating their values in real time. She felt her own age shifting in her body with the same strange elasticity, the ripple of borrowed years settling into her shoulders and spine. A sudden wave of exhaustion washed through her, heavy and ancient, and she felt the edges of the room blur, as though she were seeing the space from multiple eras at once. The ward bustling with life, then empty, then filled with shadows of celebrations long past, all superimposed over the abandoned beds and peeling paint. She tried to step back, but the floor felt different beneath her feet, more brittle, more fragile, as though she were treading upon layers of time compressed into a thin film. Her breath fell into an older rhythm, a pattern she could not place, and her joints ached in a way that suggested not merely fatigue but the crumbling sediment of many years settling into bone. When she lifted her eyes to the far corner of the room, she saw a faint shimmer, the air contorting around an invisible shape, and for a moment she thought she glimpsed the outline of Mr. Smith not as a ghost, but as a distant memory pulled forward by the ledger's shifting calculations. The shimmer dissipated quickly, leaving behind a sense of inevitability, and she understood then that whatever fate had claimed the others born on February 29th was not supernatural but structural, a mechanism woven into the fabric of time that used human lives as its counters. She felt the ledger pulse again, insistently this time, as though urging her to acknowledge the truth it carried. She was now the last entry, the final name on a list spanning more than a century, and her presence completed the ledger's cycle. She realized, with a sinking heaviness that tightened her throat, that time was not a passive force but an active participant in her fate. The clock struck once more, too loudly, too sharply, and the sound rippled through her like a blade drawn across the grain of her life. She closed the ledger with trembling hands, pressing it tightly against her chest as though it might still offer some measure of protection or explanation, but she felt only the low, steady breath of something vast and ancient stirring within its binding. As she turned toward the hallway, the hospital lights flickered again, and the world seemed to tilt slightly, the floor slanting beneath her feet as time adjusted its weight upon her shoulders. In that moment, Eliza understood the truth with unyielding clarity. She had not inherited Mr. Smith's years. She had inherited his place. As Eliza made her way back through the dim corridors of the hospital, the building seemed to lean inward with a quiet and knowing recognition, as though it had been waiting decades for her footsteps to return through these exact hallways in this exact sequence. The air had grown unbearably heavy, not with temperature but with accumulated years pressing softly against her skin, and she felt each breath settle deeper into her chest with the weary weight of someone who had lived far too long without ever understanding how swiftly life would pass. The ledger throbbed faintly against her ribs, not in a literal pulse but in a kind of resonant hum that traveled along her bones, a reminder that the ink inside it had shifted to accommodate her presence. She felt the pull of it, the arithmetic of borrowed time threading itself through her muscles, her joints, her memory, as though the book had extended unseen roots into her and tied her to a clock she had no way of winding back. As she approached the elevator, she caught sight of herself reflected in the brushed metal doors, and for a moment the reflection appeared normal, the face she had worn for years unchanged. But when the lights flickered overhead, the reflection rippled, and she saw the faint outline of a crease at the edge of her mouth, the soft hollowness forming beneath her eyes, and the subtle silver glint of a strand of hair that had not existed earlier that evening. Her breath caught as she leaned closer, and the reflection leaned closer with her, but the rhythm of its breathing lagged behind by a fraction of a second, the kind of temporal misalignment she had only ever seen in very old patients near the end of their lives. It frightened her in a way no ghost or shadow ever could. It was the kind of fear grounded not in the supernatural but in the recognition of a truth too ancient to defy. When the elevator doors slid open, she hesitated before stepping inside, half expecting time itself to warp the moment she crossed the threshold. But the interior was empty, quiet, and indifferent. The elevator began its slow descent, the cables groaning slightly as if carrying more than her weight, and she felt the years shifting inside her with each floor the car passed, settling into her bones like sediment drifting to the bottom of a deep, forgotten well. When she stepped back into the lobby, the hospital appeared almost peaceful, bathed in the dim glow of night cycle lighting, yet the quiet held a new quality. Not silence, but anticipation. She walked toward the restroom beside the old records room, feeling the need to confront the growing heaviness within her, and pushed the door open with a trembling hand. The mirror above the sink was streaked with age, its surface worn down by decades of fluorescent light and chemical cleaners, and her reflection stared back at her with an expression of wary recognition. She leaned in and saw the changes with unflinching clarity now. The faint wrinkling around her eyes, the slight sag beneath her cheekbones, the way her shoulders seemed to fold inward as though carrying invisible weight. These were not the normal signs of aging, but distortions, shifts that spoke of time being forced into a vessel that had not yet lived enough to hold it. As she touched her cheek, her fingertips trembled, not from cold but from the startling realization that the ledger had already begun to claim her body, reshaping it to match an age it had assigned without her consent. She opened the ledger again, unable to resist its quiet pull, and watched as the ink beside her name thickened into a number she could feel more than see, a number that seemed to pulse faintly in rhythm with her now wavering heartbeat. The digits did not represent chronological years but accumulated ones, the sum of time removed from others and redistributed into her. The air seemed to thin around her as comprehension settled in. She was no longer simply living in time, she was carrying it, absorbing the surplus years like sediment collecting in the corners of her body. The hospital lights flickered again, and her reflection blurred momentarily. For a single breath, she looked decades older, then younger, then older again, as though the ledger were recalibrating her age moment by moment, testing her against its arithmetic. When the mirror steadied, she saw her younger self replaced by someone who had lived long enough to understand the quiet cruelty of time, someone whose eyes now held the distant weariness of a century's worth of slow, accumulating weight. As she closed the ledger, a soft, rhythmic ticking filled the room, louder than the second hand of any clock she had ever heard, and she realized with creeping dread that the sound was not external but internal, reverberating through her chest like a countdown she had unknowingly begun. The hospital, sensing the shift, seemed to settle into a deeper stillness, the walls absorbing the ticking with a reverent hush, and she felt as though she had stepped into a ritual older than the building, older than any calendar. When she stepped back into the hallway, the shadows lengthened around her feet in slow, deliberate stretches, as though time were adjusting its distance from her. She made her way toward the exit, needing air, needing space, needing something to remind her that life existed outside of books that meant more than they claimed. But when she reached the main doors, the world beyond felt impossibly still, frozen under the faint glow of street lamps, whose light stretched into elongated shapes that did not match the angle of the night. She realized that time outside the hospital was behaving as strangely as time within it, condensing and stretching with each unsteady beat of her heart. She looked up at the sky and felt the ripple of another shift within her ribs, the ledger humming softly at her side. And she understood, with a quiet, devastating clarity, that the next leap year would not be a celebration. It would be a reckoning. She glanced toward the glass doors one last time, caught sight of herself reflected again, but this time the reflection did not mimic her movements perfectly. It hesitated, aged, blurred, then sharpened, as though the years within her were rearranging themselves into a pattern she had yet to comprehend. The ticking within her chest grew louder, echoing through her bones with the insistence of a clock winding itself toward a predetermined hour. She clutched the ledger to her chest, her breath now rough with the rasp of someone decades older, and as she stood beneath the flickering lights, she realized the truth that had eluded every leap year child before her. Time did not choose its keepers by chance. It chose them by necessity. And now, with Mr. Smith gone, and the ledger's arithmetic resting wholly upon her shoulders, she heard the soft whisper of inevitability in the ticking of her own heart. The countdown had begun. The gardener's soil. Sarah had always imagined New England as a mosaic of quiet hillsides and gentle, whispering forests. But the B&B she arrived at felt carved out of something older and more private, a place where the land seemed to watch newcomers before deciding how to greet them. The house stood at the edge of a vast garden that unfurled like a tapestry of green rows of dahlias in improbable colors, clusters of hydrangeas so large they seemed sculpted rather than grown, in a long glass greenhouse glinting dully in the late afternoon sun. The air smelled thick with earth and sap, the kind of scent that settled into the lungs with a weight that felt both comforting and vaguely intrusive. When she stepped out of her car, the chirring of crickets swelled around her like a continuous, delicate pulse, accompanied by the low rustle of leaves stirred by wind she could not feel on her skin. The elderly couple who owned the B&B greeted her with the kind of warmth that felt worn from use, a gentle, careful hospitality that disguised something quieter beneath the surface, an undercurrent of watchfulness, as though they were evaluating whether the house would accept her the way the garden appeared to. They spoke often of their son, the gardener, a man described with soft smiles and lingering pauses, someone whose memory seemed carefully tended yet never fully explained. As they carried her luggage inside, the old wooden floorboards creaked softly, the sound rising in delicate echoes that reminded her of a house taking stock of its newest visitor. The scent of soil drifted into the foyer from an open back door, warm and strangely metallic, and Sarah felt a faint shiver run down her arms as she glimpsed the garden stretching beyond the threshold, its vibrant rows illuminated with an intensity that seemed a shade too vivid for natural light. Late that evening, after settling into her room and shaking off the exhaustion from her long drive, Sarah wandered toward the back of the B&B, drawn by the soft glow of lanterns lining the garden path. The air had grown cooler, but the garden radiated a gentle warmth, as if the soil beneath her feet contained its own quiet heartbeat. She noticed immediately that the earth here was unlike any she had seen. Dark, impossibly dark. a deep shade of maroon that bordered on black, rich and moist, even though there had been no rain for days. When she knelt to touch it, the texture felt unnervingly soft, like ground that had been turned again and again by hands unwilling to let it rest. Her fingertips came away slightly stained, not with mud but with a faint reddish tint that looked almost like diluted wine. The crickets chirred in long, unbroken sequences, and somewhere deeper in the garden she heard a soft, rhythmic clicking that she assumed came from a garden tool being set down or picked up until she realized the sound repeated with uncanny precision, too steady to be the casual work of a human hand. She straightened, brushing her palms on her jeans, and found herself glancing toward the greenhouse. Its glass panels fogged from the inside as though something warm and damp breathed continuously within it. The faint light strung along the rafters cast shifting, amber reflections on the glass, and the longer she looked, the more she felt that the interior shadows moved with purpose rather than sway. A sudden breeze brushed past her, carrying with it a hushed whisper, so faint she questioned whether she heard it or imagined it. A murmured syllable, shaped like longing or warning. She turned toward the house, noticing the elderly wife standing in the doorway, her eyes fixed on the soil clinging to Sarah's hands. Her expression softened into sadness for a moment, a fleeting sorrow that vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a gentle insistence that Sarah come inside before the garden grew colder. Sarah obeyed, not out of politeness, but out of a strange sense that the garden had grown aware of her presence and was waiting. That night, she lay awake beneath the faint hum of summer insects, unable to shake the feeling of soil still clinging to her fingertips even after she had washed her hands twice. The window beside her bed overlooked a patch of the garden, and through the sheer curtains she watched the shadows shift in slow, deliberate patterns, as though the plants were adjusting themselves inch by inch under the cover of darkness. She tried to tell herself it was nothing more than wind or her travel-worn mind playing tricks on her, but as she listened to the soft thrum of cricket song blending with deeper, more irregular sounds, she sensed a rhythm beneath it all, the subtle, wet compression of soil shifting, the muted creak of roots stretching, the faint crunch that resembled chewing. It wasn't loud enough to be alarming, but it was persistent, like something working tirelessly just beneath the surface. As sleep pulled her in unevenly, her final coherent thought before drifting off was that the garden seemed hungry in a way she could not yet understand, and that the darkness cloaking it felt less like an absence of light and more like the closing of eyelids over something patiently awake below the soil. Sarah woke before dawn, long before any alarm could have disturbed her, with the distinct sensation that something had been breathing beneath her pillow. Her heart thudded heavily as she pushed herself upright, listening to the thin morning quiet that had replaced the nighttime chorus of insects. The air in her room held an earthy density, as though the soil from the garden had drifted in through the cracked window and settled along the baseboards during the night. When she approached the glass, she saw the garden bathed in the bluish tint of early morning, the plants standing impossibly still, too still, as though holding their breath after a night of movement they were not meant to reveal to human eyes. A faint trail of dark soil smeared the windowsill beneath her fingertips, and for a moment she wondered if she had walked in her sleep, if she had carried the garden inside with her in some half-conscious wandering. As she moved through the hall toward the kitchen, the floorboards groaned beneath her weight in a slow, measured rhythm that echoed her own hesitant steps, and she noticed small patches of soil near the staircase, each smear shaped like the softened edge of a footprint pressed by something that was not quite human. The elderly couple greeted her with the same gentle warmth as the day before, but the wife's eyes lingered too long on Sarah's hands, particularly the faint maroon stains beneath her nails that soap had failed to scrub away. The husband spoke cheerfully about breakfast and weather and garden blooms, but his voice carried the brittle cadence of someone performing a practiced routine, a rhythm meant to distract from the tension that bent the corners of his smile. Their words washed over her in muffled waves, and she found her attention drifting again and again to the back door, which had been left slightly ajar, allowing the smell of damp earth to seep into the kitchen, a smell so dense and metallic that it seemed less like soil and more like something freshly turned from a depth it should never have been removed from. After breakfast, the couple encouraged her to explore the garden in daylight, insisting she would find its beauty restorative. And though the invitation felt more like a gentle push than a suggestion, Sarah stepped outside with a tentative curiosity. The morning light revealed an unsettling orderliness to the garden, a symmetry too perfect for nature to have crafted unaided. The rows of flowers aligned with mathematical precision, the spacing between them exact, each stem angled toward the greenhouse as though in silent devotion. The soil, rich and dark, seemed to breathe faintly beneath her feet, sinking slightly with each step. Not like loose earth, but like a surface stretched taut over something restless. She knelt beside a bed of maroon dahlias and felt an inexplicable tightness in her throat when she noticed the stems were thicker than expected, almost woody, and the petals bore a faint iridescence reminiscent of bruised skin. When she brushed the soil with her fingertips, she felt a subtle warmth radiating upward, a warmth that coursed through her hand with a deliberate patience, as though the earth were studying her touch, testing whether she belonged. A low clicking sound drifted from the greenhouse, rhythmic and purposeful, and she walked toward it with a mixture of unease and fascination. As she approached, she saw condensation pooling along the inside of the glass, gathering into long, trembling droplets that clung to the surface before sliding downward in slow, deliberate trails. The shadows within the greenhouse shifted with the timidity of something alive but hesitant, and as she peered closer, she sensed the faint stirring of roots against soil, the soft friction of something burrowing or rising. A sudden whisper of movement brushed her ankle, sending a jolt through her as she looked down to find a thin, pale root retracting quickly beneath the soil as if startled by being noticed. She stumbled back, her breath catching in her chest, and when she glanced toward the house, she saw the elderly wife watching her from the kitchen window, her expression masked by a paleness that had nothing to do with age. By afternoon, the sunlight had taken on a heavy golden tone, thickening the warm scent of soil until the air tasted almost sweet, and Sarah found herself wandering the garden's deeper paths as though drawn by a force older than curiosity. She paused near a wide circular bed at the garden center, where the soil was darker still, almost black, and gave off a faint steam despite the mild temperature. She crouched, mesmerized by the texture of the earth, noticing how it seemed to pulse with a subtle rhythm, expanding and contracting like a slow breath. The faint chewing sound she had heard the night before whispered up from beneath the surface, muffled by layers of soil but unmistakably deliberate, and she felt her stomach tighten with the instinctive knowledge that something beneath the garden was alive, not in the way a root system lived, but in the way a memory lingered. The sensation grew sharper when her foot slipped slightly on the loosened soil, revealing a glimpse of something pale beneath the top layer fabric, torn and frayed, stained by years of contact with the subterranean world. She froze, unable to summon the will to dig deeper, yet unable to turn away from the truth blooming darkly at the edge of her comprehension. The wind shifted, carrying with it a whisper soft and trembling, syllables shaped from breath and soil and grief, and she realized with a throb of dread that the voice belonged to no living person. The garden around her seemed to lean closer, the stems of its flowers angling toward her in a slow, deliberate ripple, as though listening. She stepped back, but the soil sank beneath her heels in a way that felt intentional, as though gripping her lightly, testing her weight. The clicking resumed from somewhere deep beneath the garden, no longer the sound of tools, but the slow, deliberate grinding of roots twisting against bone, or bone twisting against roots. The sky dimmed briefly, though no clouds moved overhead, and Sarah felt a strange sensation rising through her feet into her legs, a heaviness, a warmth, almost a welcome. It occurred to her abruptly that the soil's dark hue was no accident of mineral content or moisture. It was the color of something that had once lived, something that had been broken down and folded back into the earth by hands determined to keep it present. She stumbled away from the circular bed, her breath shallow, the taste of dirt clinging to her tongue, and as she retreated toward the house, the garden's chorus of insects swelled into a single, vibrating drone that felt less like sound and more like the pulse of a living, hungry thing waiting beneath the soil for her to return. That night, sleep took Sarah with a heaviness that felt less like rest and more like the slow descent of soil being shoveled over her awareness, packing down her thoughts until they could no longer rise to the surface. The room darkened around her with a density that did not resemble the ordinary ebb of daylight, but something older and thicker, an encroaching shadow that filled the corners like spilled ink. As she drifted fully into unconsciousness, She found herself standing not in her bedroom but at the edge of the garden, though the plants were taller now, towering above her like silent sentinels, their leaves broad and glossy with a wet sheen that glistened crimson under a lantern's dim light. The air clung to her skin with the damp heaviness of a greenhouse at midnight, each breath thick with the scent of soil that had been turned too recently. She stepped forward, the earth beneath her feet shifting with an almost greedy softness, and the garden opened in front of her as if guiding her toward the circular bed she had disturbed earlier. A figure knelt at its center, his back curved in the posture of someone who had worked long hours under the burden of heat and expectation. She recognized him instantly, not from memory, but from the way the couple spoke of him, their gardener's son whose absence lingered like a bruise across the property. His hands plunged rhythmically into the dark soil, each movement accompanied by a wet, sucking sound. And it was only when she stepped closer that she realized he was not planting or tending but clawing, tearing at the earth with a desperation that bordered on anguish. The soil sprayed upward with each motion, spattering her feet with heavy, dark clumps that smelled faintly metallic, and when he finally turned, she saw a face streaked with sweat and dirt, and something darker, a face twisted not by rage but by terror. He reached toward her with a trembling arm, his fingers dripping with soil so dark it gleamed like oil, and she felt the cold grip of inevitability as the dream's perspective shifted. Suddenly she was inside his mind, watching as two silhouettes approached him from behind, their faces hidden, their hands carrying the weight of something blunt and unforgiving. The blow landed with a soft, sickening thud, the kind that felt muffled by dirt even before the body hit the ground. The gardener's breath escaped him in a sharp, broken sob, and then the dream erupted into a chaos of muffled sounds. The frantic scrabbling of fingernails against packed earth, the heavy thud of fists swinging downwards, the tremor of panic as he realized he was being buried alive beneath the soil he had tended with devotion. Roots tangled around his limbs with unnatural speed, tightening as though eager to claim him, and the earth swallowed his final scream with a thick, wet gulp that reverberated through her bones. Sarah jerked awake with a strangled gasp, the phantom sensation of soil filling her lungs lingering long after the dream dissipated. The room was pitch dark, save for a faint silver glow from the moon filtering through the curtains, and the heavy scent of earth clung to the air around her bed as though it had seeped through the cracks in the floorboards. For a moment she thought she was still dreaming. Then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of chewing rising from somewhere outside, soft and wet and rhythmic, like teeth working through heavy clumps of soil. The noise threaded its way through the quiet of the house and into her mind, stirring the remnants of the dream into something sharper, something insistent. She pushed herself out of bed, her hands trembling as she found her shoes, and made her way down the hallway, each step landing with the muted thud of someone walking through deep sand rather than on polished wood. The back door had been left ajar again, as though the house were urging her outside, and she stepped into the night air with a shiver that ran straight to her spine. The garden glowed faintly under the moonlight, the plants shifting with a slow, almost anticipatory sway, and the soil along the pathways appeared darker than before, damp with moisture that glistened in irregular patterns, as though something beneath the surface had been pushing upward. The dream's images pressed urgently at the front of her thoughts, the gardener's frantic clawing, the shadows closing in, the suffocating darkness beneath the soil, and she found herself moving toward the circular bed at the center with a desperation that bordered on compulsion. She seized an old shovel propped beside the greenhouse door, the metal cold and slightly rusted beneath her fingers, and she plunged it into the soil with a force that sent vibrations up her arms and into her ribs. The earth yielded too easily, as though it had already been turned recently. Then with each thrust of the shovel she heard the faint cracking of roots twisting aside, their movements sinuous and unnervingly quick. The scent of earth blossomed into the air in waves, thick and metallic and tinged with something sour, and the chewing sound grew louder, resonating from somewhere deeper below, encouraging her with a slow, dreadful rhythm. She dug faster, her breath coming in ragged heaves, the dream's terror creeping into her muscles with each motion. Then, as the shovel struck something soft and yielding, her knees buckled slightly. She pushed the dirt aside with trembling hands, uncovering the corner of fabric torn, rotted, matted with soil that clung to it like flesh. Her breath caught in her throat, and she pulled away another layer of dirt, revealing more fabric in the faint, unmistakable shape of clothing worn decades ago. The soil beneath her palms trembled as though shuddering in anticipation, and she realized with a horror that sent her heart racing that the dream had not been an echo, it had been a memory. The garden was remembering. Before she could retreat, the earth around the shovel's blade tightened with a sudden, wet grip, as if unseen hands were seizing the tool, and she stumbled backward as the soil heaved upward in a convulsive shudder. The roots beneath the surface twisted violently, writhing like a nest of serpents disturbed from slumber, their pale tendrils emerging briefly before burrowing back into the darkness. The chewing sound intensified into a frantic, layered chorus that rose from deep within the earth, vibrating through the soles of her shoes and up into her bones, and she felt the garden shifting around her with a hunger that was no longer subtle. The moonlight dimmed inexplicably. The air grew thick with the scent of decay and damp leaves, and she sensed the presence of something rising, not a ghost, not a spirit, but a consciousness rooted in soil, fed by memory, shaped by death. She fell backward onto the grass, her breath hitching as the disturbance beneath the ground settled once more into a slow, rhythmic pulse, as though the garden were inhaling deeply, tasting the air she had stirred. The plants around the circular bed leaned inward, the petals trembling, and the soil beneath the exposed fabric shifted in a way that felt unmistakably deliberate. Sarah scrambled to her feet, her hands streaked with the dark, glistening soil that now carried the faint scent of something unmistakably alive, or once alive, and she realized with a depth of fear she had never felt before that she had not uncovered the gardener's resting place. She had awakened it. Sarah staggered backward from the disturbed patch of earth, her breath hitching in sharp, uneven bursts that caught in her throat like she had inhaled a lungful of damp soil. The garden around her seemed to lean in with predatory patience, the flowers swaying in a slow, circling pattern that felt less like wind and more like a subtle choreography directed by something beneath the ground. The moonlight, which had been spilling across the garden moments earlier, dimmed beneath a veil of drifting haze, casting the beds in a soft, bluish twilight that made every leaf, petal, and blade of grass appear sharper and more sentient. Sarah could feel the unease rising inside her like a tide, a pressure that pushed against her ribs and whispered that she had trespassed on a memory not meant for the living. When she wiped her hands on her jeans, the soil clinging to her palms left streaks so dark they looked like bruises staining her skin. The texture felt wrong, almost warm, as though the earth still retained the fading echo of a pulse. She turned toward the house, hoping the familiar glow of its windows would offer clarity or refuge, but the path seemed longer, its edges blurred by shadows that shifted with unnatural deliberation. The greenhouse loomed to her right like a silent witness, its glass fogged with condensation that pulsed faintly from within, each pulse in strange synchronization with the faint vibration under her feet. She tried to rationalize the sound, to convince herself that what she heard was nothing more than roots settling or small nocturnal animals burrowing, but the chewing, slow, wet, rhythmic rose again from beneath the circular bed she had disturbed, and the cadence aligned with the thud of her accelerating heartbeat so precisely that she felt the garden listening to her panic. As she stumbled toward the back porch, the door swung open abruptly, and the elderly couple emerged with expressions carved from a blend of sorrow and inevitability, the kind of grief that had grown familiar to them over time. Their presence did not bring comfort. Instead, Sarah felt a chill prickle along her arms as she noticed how neither of them looked surprised to see her covered in soil, trembling and pale. The husband stepped forward with careful, almost ceremonial slowness, as though approaching someone caught in the throes of illness or transformation. The wife's eyes, shimmering with a mixture of regret and pleading, held Sarah's gaze with an intensity that made the garden's shifting shadows momentarily blur at the edges of her vision. They did not scold her for digging, nor did they question why she had fled the house in the middle of the night. Instead, their postures spoke of resignation, as though they had been bracing for this moment long before she arrived. Sarah opened her mouth to demand answers, to speak the truth of the dream that had felt more like a memory stolen from the earth, but her voice caught before any sound escaped. The soil on her palms seemed to tighten, drying into a thin, constricting film, and she felt the faintest vibration along her skin, the same subtle tremor she had sensed when she first touched the soil the day before. When the husband reached out, attempting to steady her arm, she flinched as the soil seemed to warm beneath his touch. As though recognizing him, his expression sagged with quiet dread, and he withdrew his hand with the reverence one might show toward a relic or a ticking device. He spoke in a soft, trembling murmur, words paced with the slowness of someone who had lived alongside a devouring secret for far too long, and though Sarah could not discern every syllable, she understood the meaning beneath them. The garden had chosen her attention, and once chosen, the garden never relinquished what it desired. The wife stepped closer, her voice barely rising above a whisper, carrying the weight of suppressed confession. She gestured toward the darkened plot of land Sarah had dug into, her hand trembling slightly as she explained in fragmented, sorrowful phrases that their son had not simply died but had been pulled into the soil by the very garden he tended, absorbed into its memory the way certain plants draw nourishment from what is buried beneath. They had tried to save him, she insisted, her voice cracking under the strain of truth pushed down for decades. But the garden had grown attached to him, his sweat, his blood, the imprint of his footsteps and tools in its soil, and when he died, the garden refused to let go. It had taken him into its roots and used his essence to flourish, binding his life to its cycles in a symbiotic hunger that neither parent could fully explain. When new guests arrived, particularly those who expressed fascination with the garden or lingered near the soil, the garden grew curious, reaching out through its roots to taste their presence, to test whether they might one day replace the nourishment it continued to draw from their son's remains. The couple had spent years trying to divert that attention, tending the soil themselves, offering it animal compost, mineral supplements, anything to keep it satisfied, but the garden, now half spirit and half earth, preferred what it had grown from: human life, human grief, human bone. Sarah felt her stomach twist as the truth sank into her, each word echoing the dream she had witnessed. The roots beneath the soil had not been reaching toward her out of confusion or curiosity. They had been remembering her touch, tasting it, evaluating its potential. The elderly husband lowered his gaze, unable to look at her any longer, and the wife's hands trembled as she folded them over her apron. Their silence revealed what their words could not. The garden was hungry again, and its hunger was no longer satiated by memory alone. As the couple stepped back, the garden behind them seemed to inhale, drawing the night air inward with a subtle shift that caused the lantern's flame above the porch to flicker violently. The ground beneath Sarah's feet softened with unnerving swiftness, the soil loosening in a spiraling pattern around her boots, as though welcoming her into its depth. The plants nearest to her tilted imperceptibly toward her, their leaves trembling with an eagerness that carried the faint suggestion of hunger. Panic surged through her as she stepped back toward the porch, but the ground clung to her weight, gripping the soles of her shoes with a viscous resistance that made every movement feel slow and doomed. She braced herself and pulled harder, feeling the soil tighten like a desperate hand refusing to let go. The elderly wife cried out an involuntary plea shaped by decades of regret, but the sound was swallowed almost immediately by the garden's low, throbbing hum. Sarah felt the vibration rise through her legs, a warm, pulsing rhythm that traveled up her spine and into her skull, clouding her thoughts with a strange blend of terror and surrender. Beneath the soil, the chewing sound began again, louder now, layered with the sickening, fibrous crackle of roots twisting rapidly through earth in search of something tender. The husband tried to reach for her, but the garden surged upward with sudden force, roots bursting through the surface like pale limbs, curling around her ankles with swift, ecstatic precision. The soil yawned beneath her as though opening a mouth, and Sarah felt herself sink inch by inch, the earth enveloping her legs, her hips, her torso, pulling her into the same darkness that had claimed the gardener years before. The last thing she saw before the soil rose over her face was the luminous gleam of the greenhouse glass pulsing softly in the distance, and in the moment before everything went silent, she heard the faint whisper of a voice, low, grateful, and unmistakably familiar, thanking her for helping the garden grow. The moment the earth closed over her, Sarah felt a darkness unlike any she had ever known. Thick, immediate, and intimate, as though the soil were not merely touching her but folding itself into the shape of her body with deliberate care. She sank through layers of damp earth that pressed against her skin with the gentle firmness of hands guiding her downward, and though her instinct screamed for breath, the soil filled her mouth and nose with a warmth that made it impossible to distinguish air from earth. It was not suffocation in the conventional sense. It was something older and more deliberate, a ritual of absorption performed with the patience of roots exploring new territory. The darkness pulsed faintly with shades of red and brown, colors she should not have been able to perceive underground. Yet she saw them clearly, as if the soil itself possessed vision, showing her what it remembered. She felt textures sliding over her arms and legs, thin tendrils of roots brushing against her skin, welcoming her, testing her, mapping her form the way memories map the mind. Her heartbeat, frantic at first, gradually slowed as it synchronized with the deep, rhythmic hum resonating through the earth, a sound she recognized from her dreams and from the restless breathing of the garden at night. It was the sound of something thinking in the way soil thinks, through pressure, through warmth, through cycles of decay and renewal. She felt her fingers twitch, trying to claw upward, but the soil closed gently around them, holding them as though guiding a child into stillness. The tendrils wrapped more firmly around her wrists and ankles, pulling her deeper into the cool, shifting belly of the garden. And then, as the soil pressed against her ears, her eyes, her lips, a whisper traveled along the threads of the roots, not a voice in the traditional sense, but a vibration of memory and longing. It carried the weight of the gardener's final breath, the echo of his fear, the ache of his longing to remain in the world he had nurtured. The voice, now faint but unmistakably human in its yearning, thanked her again not with triumph, but with the weary gratitude of someone who had been waiting decades for release. She felt her chest tighten, not with panic, but with the unsettling sense that she understood that gratitude, that her presence had eased a hunger too vast for the elderly couple to sate alone. As the soil continued to draw her inward, the sensations around her shifted from crushing pressure to something more fluid, like sinking into warm water that flowed in slow, deliberate currents. Her awareness stretched into places it did not belong, feeling the movement of roots spiraling downward, the tremble of worms navigating their blind tunnels, the faint pulse of mineral veins carrying the memory of rainstorms from uncounted years. She sensed the gardener's presence more fully now, not as a ghost or spirit, but as a pattern woven into the soil, a human consciousness diluted yet persistent within the roots that had consumed his body. His memories drifted into her like fragments, carried on currents. The warmth of the sun on his neck as he planted seeds that would outlive him, the heaviness of his father's expectations weighing on his spine, the softness of his mother's voice carried on the evening wind as she worked beside him in the garden. These memories were not shown to her out of kindness, but because she now occupied the same network of roots that held him. Each recollection threaded through her mind with unsettling clarity, blurring the boundary between what belonged to him and what belonged to her. She felt her own memories slipping beneath the surface, pulled downward like leaves settling into sediment. Her childhood bedroom, her friends, her long drives and small joys all dimming as the soil coated them with layers of distance. The gardener's life mingled with her own until she could no longer separate where his fears ended and hers began. And through it all, she sensed the garden's hunger, vast and patient, whispering beneath the words, not malicious but instinctive, the way a forest instinctively breaks down fallen bark and bone. She realized then, with a clarity sharpened by dread, that the garden did not merely consume, it transformed. It turned memories into nutrients, fear into fertilizer, longing into growth. She felt her limbs grow heavy, her skin tingling as roots brushed against her with increasing familiarity, mapping the contours of her face and tracing the line of her jaw as though learning her shape in preparation for something inevitable. Above her, the world felt impossibly far away, its sounds muted into soft vibrations carried through soil. Yet she sensed the movements of the elderly couple standing at the garden's edge, their silhouettes faint but heavy with sorrow. They whispered to each other in voices warped by guilt and grief, their words trembling with the weight of resignation. They spoke of cycles they could not break, of a son they had loved, who had become part of something larger and hungrier than they ever intended. Their voices faded as the soil deepened around Sarah, the pressure on her chest now rhythmic, matching the slow, steady pulse of the garden itself. She felt the roots climb higher along her torso, curling gently beneath her ribs, weaving through the spaces between bone and muscle with a tenderness that frightened her more deeply than violence ever could. It felt intimate, invasive, loving in the way soil loves what it consumes. Her breath grew shallow as the roots pressed into her lungs, tasting the air she had carried from above. The garden shuddered around her with delight, sensing the final stages of assimilation, and she realized, with cold clarity, that she was no longer being buried. She was being planted. Her body would break down, not abruptly, but gradually, feeding the roots with memories, blood, and bone. Her thoughts, once sharp and distinct, blurred into the gardener's echoes, two lives merging into a single root system bound by decades of longing and soil. She felt her heart falter, then reestablish its rhythm not according to her body, but according to the deeper pulse of the earth wrapping itself around her. The soil pressed against her face with a warmth that felt frighteningly gentle, sealing her vision into darkness. And for a moment, she thought she heard the gardener's voice, not from above or within, but through the roots themselves, whispering with a reverence born of shared fate. He told her she was home now, that the soil would take care of her, and that her presence would allow the garden to thrive for many years to come. The moment her consciousness dimmed, a surge rippled through the garden above, a tremor that shook the leaves and sent petals fluttering like lost feathers. New stems unfurled at unnatural speed, their blossoms expanding with vibrant, eerie beauty born of rich nourishment. The elderly couple watched with hollowed eyes as the garden pulsed softly, absorbing its newest memory, its newest voice, its newest offering. The soil settled back into place, smooth and unmarred, as though no disturbance had ever occurred, and a faint whisper traveled through the leaves, with the rustling of the wind, a whisper carrying Sarah's voice now intertwined with the gardener's, thanking the earth in a tone soaked with surrender and inevitability. The garden exhaled, its hunger satisfied for the moment, its roots resting beneath the surface with the contentment of something that had fed deeply. And as the dawn crept across the horizon, casting pale gold across the glass of the greenhouse, the soil glistened with the promise of new blooms, unaware or unconcerned that it had consumed yet another life in its endless, patient cycle of remembering. The midnight frequency. Marcus had always believed that the graveyard shift belonged to a different kind of time, a quieter hour carved out of the world's exhaustion, where the city exhaled and the night itself stretched thin over the skyline like a worn blanket. On most nights, the studio felt like a second skin to him, a familiar cocoon of muted computer fans, the soft glow of soundboards blinking like patient fireflies, and the low hum of equipment that had been running longer than he had worked there. The building's upper floors were silent, abandoned after the day crew clocked out, leaving him alone with hundreds of empty offices stacked above his head like dormant cells. The control room's glass panels reflected his movements with a faint reverb of light, making him feel as though he was sharing the space with a quieter, more obedient version of himself. Beyond those reflections, outside the narrow windows, the city lights flickered in the distance, indifferent and unreachable. Marcus took comfort in the isolation. There was no pressure to perform for an audience, because there wasn't one. His late-night show existed mostly to fill airtime, a soft jazz loop blended with occasional commentary, a voice for insomniacs, truckers passing through, or no one at all. His hands traced the switches with instinctive familiarity, adjusting levels, settling into the predictable rhythm of another night where nothing would happen. Yet beneath that routine lay an emptiness he felt growing with each broadcast, an awareness that he was speaking into a void that never spoke back. Some nights, he imagined his words drifting endlessly through the static of unused frequencies, dissolving in the space between towers, evaporating like mist over the rooftops. But on this particular night, something shifted the moment the studio clock hit 2:13 a.m. A small, seemingly inconsequential moment, marked only by the faint electronic chirp of his workstation as it auto-saved the playlist. The jazz loop dipped unexpectedly, not fading so much as shrinking, as though the sound itself were being pulled inward. Marcus frowned at the monitor, expecting a software glitch, but the meters continued to rise and fall in their usual pattern. Then, deep beneath the music's saxophone sighs, a soft interference bled through the feed, a tremor of static that was neither loud nor disruptive but strangely alive, as if someone had brushed a fingertip along the station's antenna. At first, he dismissed it, adjusting the gain and leaning closer to the speakers with the mild annoyance of someone addressing a problem he had handled a dozen times before. Yet, the static did not behave like static. It pulsed in a slow, deliberate rhythm, a faint whispering cadence buried beneath the white noise, so subtle he might have mistaken it for imagination if not for the way it tugged at the back of his mind. The sound reminded him of breath shaped around syllables that were not yet words but almost were. He leaned closer still, his ear inches from the speaker, and felt a chill crawl along the side of his neck, as though the sound had exhaled directly onto his skin. He toggled through channels, checking for bleed-through from another broadcast, but the meters remained clean. Frequency X, an unused channel the station kept dormant, glowed faintly on the screen, its readout showing activity that should not have been possible. The station had no transmitter assigned to it, no recorded content, no licensed purpose, and yet its bar rose and fell with uncanny precision, carrying that whispering pulse like something rehearsed. The whispering grew clearer as Marcus isolated the frequency, its sounds threading through the jazz loop until the two blended into something unsettlingly harmonious. He felt an inexplicable pull in his chest, a weight that made him straighten his posture as though bracing himself. The noise shifted between tones, soft at first, then tightening into subtle patterns that played at the edges of memory. It reminded him of something he had heard as a child, lying on the carpet with his face pressed close to the old family radio, a place where voices sometimes surfaced from nowhere, faded transmissions from other towns or other storms, ghost channels drifting through the atmosphere. He remembered listening to a commercial once, something old-fashioned and cheerful about a neighborhood candy shop, a jingle that never made sense because the shop had closed before he was born. His parents told him he had probably imagined it, or that he had mistakenly tuned into an archival station. But now, as a faint strain of melody wound into the static, so quiet he almost missed it, he felt that childhood jingle unfurl like a long-forgotten vine. The notes were slow, warped by age, and carried on a whisper that curled through the speakers with gentle insistence. His own name flickered through the sound, not clearly spoken but implied in the cadence, as though the whispering voice knew him intimately, the way someone knows the rhythm of their own breath. Marcus's pulse quickened, not out of fear but from a strange recognition that he could not place. He glanced through the glass panels again, half expecting to see someone standing in the control room, watching him. But the studio remained empty, its quiet reflections showing only Marcus and the glow of his equipment. The whisper rose once more, brushing against the edges of comprehension, and he felt a tremor of unease tighten through his chest. Something on Frequency X was speaking not to an audience, not to the world, but to him. And as the jazz loop faded into a thin ribbon of sound, the whispering continued in that same slow rhythm, as though patiently waiting for him to answer. Marcus tried to steady his breathing as he leaned back in his chair, the vinyl cushion releasing a faint hiss of air beneath his weight, as though mimicking the soft static lingering through the room. The jazz loop had now become a thin backdrop, distant and warbled, like a record left too close to a radiator. His fingers hovered over the console, unsure which control to adjust or whether he should touch anything at all, because every shift he made seemed to sharpen the strange pulse of sound coming through Frequency X. The whispering no longer drifted at the edge of his awareness. It pressed inward with the assertiveness of something trying to shape itself into words he had forgotten he once knew. A low reverb hung in the air, amplifying the sense of emptiness in the studio, and Marcus became increasingly aware of how the silence around him behaved differently tonight. It was not the typical quiet of a building after hours. It had texture, weight, a hum beneath it that felt organic rather than electronic. He listened as the whispering ebbed and flowed like someone pacing just outside the reach of the microphone, inhaling sharply before speaking, then retreating into static again. Each time the breath caught, Something familiar stirred in Marcus's memory. A half-forgotten sensation from childhood nights spent hiding under the covers, with a transistor radio pressed to his ear. The sound now carried the same hesitant cadence he used to hear when distant stations bled into each other, except this whisper did not feel distant at all. It felt unnervingly near. He leaned closer involuntarily, drawn by the subtle familiarity threaded through the noise, and as he did, the sound resolved into a shape that pulsed like a heartbeat, against every instinct telling him to pull away. He pressed the headphones tighter to his ears. The static narrowed to a thin seam, a quiet crackling, and then something slipped through a phrase, soft and warped, spoken in a rasp he recognized not because he heard it often, but because he had not heard it in years. It was the name only his mother had used when waking him gently from nightmares, a name he had not told anyone at the station, uttered in the exact tone she used on nights when the storm outside made the house groan. Marcus froze, his pulse stumbling in his chest as the whisper settled into a rhythm that spoke directly to whatever fragile place inside him remembered what it felt like to be small, afraid, and convinced that the world could hear his private fears. The console lights flickered as the signal strengthened, casting faint, wavering glows across the glass of the control room, turning Marcus's reflection into a silhouette with trembling edges. He reached for the isolation toggle again, hoping to identify the source. But the moment he touched it, the whispering surged, layering itself with an old, almost cheerful melody, the unmistakable beginning of that childhood jingle he had heard on the floor of his parents' living room. The melody should have sounded innocent, even comforting, but tonight it carried a hollow undertone. The cheeriness thinned into something brittle and off-key, as though the years had stretched it too far. Marcus felt his throat tighten as he remembered the commercial that never logically should have reached his childhood radio. The candy shop that closed before he was born, the one his mother reminisced about only in passing, always with a wistful smile. The jingle had promised late-night sweets for brave little sleepers, and he remembered asking her once if it was still open, if they could go there. She had looked startled, almost frightened, before smoothing his hair and telling him it must have been a dream. But the melody drifting through frequency X now was unmistakably the same, every note replicated with eerie precision, wrapped in a veil of static that made it feel like it had traveled a long distance, not across geography, but across time. Marcus swallowed hard, his hand trembling over the switch, and listened as the whispering began to shape itself again, merging with the melody until it formed a strange, broken monologue about choices, regrets, and promises forgotten. The voice spoke about a boy who used to wait at the window for storms to pass, about a teenager who never returned the call from a friend who needed him, about a man who once promised himself he would not end up speaking to empty rooms. Each sentence burrowed into Marcus like a blade, not because of what was said, but because the voice described details he had never voiced, allowed mistakes he had tucked deep into the quiet spaces of his life. The soundboard flickered again, the meters rising with each whispered word, and Marcus felt something inside him shift, a realization forming with slow, shuddering certainty. The signal was not pulling information from archives or old broadcasts. It was speaking from somewhere impossibly close to him, a place that knew what he had forgotten and remembered what he tried to bury. He pushed himself back from the console, the wheels of his chair scraping across the floor with a jarring screech that cut through the whispering for only a moment. The silence that followed was not true silence, but a hissing void, like the breath of someone waiting to be acknowledged. Marcus felt watched, not by a presence in the room, but by the sound itself, as though the frequency had turned its attention toward him with a quiet, heavy curiosity. He tried to gather his thoughts, but the memory stirred by the signal scattered through his mind, refusing to settle. The whisper returned with a slow sigh, this time clearer and more confident, and Marcus heard a sequence of numbers that sent a tremor through his entire body. The coordinates of the station, followed by a date, years into the future. His future. The whispering wove these details into a soft chant, layered with the faint background noise of his own breathing. It felt like listening to a recording of himself from a moment that had not yet happened. His pulse hammered against his ribs as the realization took root. Whatever was speaking through frequency X was not reaching out from somewhere else in the world. It was reaching backward, from when, or from which version of him, he could not yet understand. But as the whispering thickened into coherent cadence once more, and as it spoke with a tone that trembled with exhaustion and a dread Marcus had not yet lived, he understood that the frequency was not malfunctioning. It was opening, and something on the other side of that opening knew him intimately, relentlessly, and had been waiting for him to listen. Marcus remained frozen before the console, his breath shallow, his palms sweating against the armrests of his chair as though the faux leather were heating beneath him. The whispering on frequency X had shifted again, thinning into a faint oscillation that felt more like a heartbeat than a sound, a low rhythmic pulse that resonated through the studio walls with uncanny precision. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing against his ears like the pressure before a storm, and he found himself counting silently, matching each breath to the rise and fall of the signal. As he watched the waveform dance on the monitor, he realized it no longer behaved like a normal audio pattern. It flexed and contracted in ways that resembled a living response, subtly adjusting itself whenever he moved. He shifted in his chair, and the frequency trailed upward in a soft, questioning hum. He leaned closer to the mic console, and the static narrowed to a single thin line, almost like someone holding their breath. A chill coursed through him, not just from the uncanny synchronicity, but from the unmistakable sensation that the studio itself had changed shape, its acoustics bending in ways that amplified even the quietest movements. The click of his fingernail against the board, the faint brush of fabric as he adjusted his posture, the sound of his throat tightening in hesitation. The room no longer felt like an insulated cube of equipment and layered soundproofing. It felt like a chamber designed to resonate his every thought. He tried to clear his head, but the whispering seeped in again, this time not as a sound to be heard, but as a pressure forming inside his skull, shaping itself into memories he had not revisited in years. He saw flashes of himself sitting in old studios as a young intern, filled with ambition that would later dissolve into quieter disappointment. He heard echoes of his first broadcast, his voice uncertain, but bright with possibility. These memories did not surface gently, they were pushed forward by the whisper, guided with the precision of someone flipping through pages, looking for the next moment to expose. As the whisper strengthened, the faint melody from before returned, not as the childhood jingle, but as something far older and more resonant, a tone that hummed with a strange metallic warmth, layered with multiple voices speaking in the same cadence. Marcus realized with a jolt that the voices were all versions of himself at different ages. The soft timbre of teenage Marcus, the clipped professional cadence he used in his 20s, the worn duskiness of his present-day voice. They merged and separated, overlapping in patterns that suggested conversation rather than chaos. He felt his chest tighten as the voices replayed a fragment of a recording he had never made but recognized instantly, a future broadcast where he spoke in a tone that trembled with exhaustion, discussing regrets he had not yet experienced, referencing a night he had not yet lived. The reflection in the studio glass shifted subtly, the dim glow of the control room lights revealing his silhouette with an unsettling distortion, as if the glass were bending the shape of his outline to match the voice speaking through the frequency. The whispering pulsed again, this time forming a sentence he understood clearly, spoken in a voice that carried the brittle edges of age and dread. It told him he had forgotten something essential, something he had buried beneath years of quiet self-preservation. The moment he stopped believing his life could change. The whisper traced the contours of that moment with eerie accuracy, the night he accepted the graveyard shift permanently, the night he convinced himself it was fine to speak into silence because silence did not judge. Marcus felt his pulse thundering in his ears, the cadence merging with the waveform on the monitor until he could not distinguish where the sound ended and his heartbeat began. The future version of his voice began recounting details from a day Marcus had not yet lived. A phone call he would ignore, a choice he would regret, a broadcast where he would hear himself whispering from a timeline he had not yet stepped into. Every detail unfurled with slow, suffocating clarity, each one a thread tying him more deeply to the idea that this frequency was not reaching toward him. It was pulling him toward something inevitable. The jazz loop in the background faltered again, collapsing into a broken series of notes that lingered like the last flickers of a dying bulb. The studio lights dimmed without warning, leaving Marcus illuminated only by the cold glow of the screens, their flickering reflections casting elongated shadows across the sound booth. As his gaze darted to the glass panel separating him from the recording room, he caught sight of movement, subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably real. His reflection did not mirror him. The figure behind the glass remained perfectly still even as he leaned closer, its posture rigid, its shoulders slightly slumped as though carrying a burden he had not yet taken on. The face was his, but paler, drawn tight with sleeplessness, and touched with the fragile transparency of someone whose life had been stretched thin by too many nights in rooms just like this one. The reflection lifted its hand in a slow, deliberate motion, pressing its palm to the surface of the glass. Marcus's own hand remained frozen by his side, trembling. He could not bring himself to raise it. The whispering surged in a single, unified breath, filling the studio with the sensation of a presence inhaling deeply from the other side of the frequency. His future self's lips moved, but the glass muffled the words until the sound fed back into the console and emerged through the headset. A whisper soaked in dread and resignation. It told him the frequency had no beginning and no ending. It simply waited for the moment he would listen closely enough to hear himself calling from a point where choices had run out. Marcus felt the room coil around him like a tightening spiral, the reverb swelling with a pressure that blurred the boundary between his body and the sound. As the reflection leaned closer, its breath fogged the inside of the glass, something no reflection should be able to do. And in that breath, Marcus heard the faint, rhythmic tapping of metal, as if the figure beyond the glass held something heavy, waiting for the moment to strike. The whispering resolved into a final, steady pulse, threading his name into the static with a familiarity that hollowed him out. And Marcus realized then, with bone-deep certainty, that he was not listening to a warning. He was listening to a memory, one that had not yet happened, but would. The studio air thickened with an almost physical density, as though the walls had drawn closer while Marcus watched the reflection that refused to obey him. He felt suspended between breaths, trapped in the narrow moment where panic had not yet erupted but was gathering itself like storm clouds along the horizon. The fluorescent light above him flickered with a strained hum, casting a tremulous sheen across the recording booth, and his reflection absorbed that trembling glow as though it existed in a space where electricity behaved differently. The figure's eyes were sunken but unmistakably his, ringed with the hollow fatigue of a man who had spent not just hours but years inside this room, marinating in static until it had seeped into the softest parts of his mind. Marcus felt an instinctive pull to look away, yet the frequency behind him rose in a slow crescendo, the whisper now shaped like a breath drawn closer to a microphone, impossibly close, as if the voice had leaned in until its lips brushed the mesh. He knew, without understanding how he knew, that the sound did not come from any equipment. It came from the space directly behind him. When he turned, only the empty studio met his eyes, silent monitors, blinking LEDs, the soft thrum of ventilation. Yet the whisper, low and tremulous, slid along the inside of his skull with the unmistakable timbre of his own voice pushed to the edge of exhaustion. It spoke without words at first, a strained sigh carrying the heaviness of someone who had witnessed too much, and Marcus felt his breath stutter as the signal shifted on the display. The waveform bent, distorting into a shape that matched the rhythm of his heart, then changed again, syncing not with the present pulse in his chest but with a slower beat, as though mimicking the physiology of a man far closer to collapse. The figure in the glass lifted something from below the edge of the console, a blunt, heavy shape that glinted faintly in the weakened light. Marcus's stomach clenched as the object rose into view, unmistakable despite the distortions of reflection, the dulled steel head of a workman's hammer, the kind maintenance crews used to crack old panels open. His reflection held it with a familiarity Marcus could not reconcile, fingers curled around the handle with the weary inevitability of someone who had lifted it many times before. The whispering bled into the monitor feed with an eerie smoothness, carrying phrases now, fragmented pieces of regret spoken in his own cadence but fractured by static. The voice reminded him of the moment he nearly quit the station and didn't, the moment he let an important relationship fade out because silence felt easier. The moment he convinced himself he would someday move to a daytime shift, even though he had never asked for one. These pieces twisted together until they formed something that felt like a confession spoken by a future self who no longer believed in change. Marcus felt his throat tighten as the jazz loop evaporated entirely, replaced by a low, trembling hum that originated not from the speakers but from the frequency panels themselves. The lights on the board flickered in a sequence that resembled Morse code, though he could not decipher the pattern, and the reverb in the room swelled until even his inhalations echoed back at him, layered and distorted. He heard, with sickening clarity, the reflections hammer, tap lightly against the console, 1, 2, 3 slow knocks which reverberated through the booth despite the physical impossibility of sound crossing a sealed mirror. The real console beneath Marcus's hands vibrated in sympathy, as if the blow had echoed across time rather than space. The whisper on frequency X rose again with startling sharpness, forming a sentence so clear it left no oxygen in his lungs. It spoke of an ending he would choose, an ending he had already enacted in another iteration of himself. An ending meant not to silence the frequency, but to silence the version of him who could not bear to keep listening. Marcus stumbled to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him, and backed away from the console, but the room seemed smaller than before, the angles wrong, the reflective glass bending like a lens around his retreat. The waveform on the monitor surged, becoming a frantic vertical tremor, and the voice of his future self broke through with exhausted clarity, pleading in a tone twisted by the echoes of a man who had screamed too long into empty rooms. Marcus felt the energy in the studio shift, the buzz of electricity gathering in the wires, and he looked back toward the glass just in time to see the reflection raise the hammer again, not in violence, but in weary determination, the posture of someone ending a cycle that had trapped them far too long. The whispering sharpened into a single phrase, spoken in his voice, but older, cracked, and soaked through with despair. The room responded by dimming to near darkness, the equipment humming with the low, tremor-like vibration of something building toward rupture. Marcus's breaths came in shallow bursts as he reached toward the console instinctively, not knowing what he intended, turn it off, disconnect himself, or destroy the frequency entirely, but the monitors exploded in a smear of static before he could act. The whisper swelled, shaping itself into a final murmur that brushed the back of his mind with the intimacy of a hand guiding him toward something inevitable. And in the reflection's final, flickering movement, he saw his future self step forward with the hammer poised as though ready to break the only barrier keeping the two of them apart. The studio trembled with a low, subterranean hum as Marcus braced his hands against the console, each breath tearing through him with the jagged force of someone trying to hold two timelines apart with nothing but willpower. The lights flickered again, sinking the room into alternating flashes of dim red and pale blue, the kind of emergency hues that made every surface look warped and waterlogged. The waveform on the central monitor spasmed with chaotic motion, then froze entirely, holding a single, unwavering line of static light that radiated across the screen like a heartbeat that had given up on rhythm. The whispering from frequency X did not fade with it. Instead, it swelled to fill the room, not loud, but dense, the way fog can make the air feel heavier even when you can still see through it. Marcus felt the vibrations crawling beneath the floor, slipping up through the soles of his shoes and into the roots of his spine, as if the frequency had grown tired of using speakers and now wanted to occupy the physical space of the booth. He backed away from the console, his hands shaking as he pressed them against the soundproof wall, though tonight the wall felt far from soundproof. Each whisper seeped through it like moisture, carrying the weight of something already decided. He glanced at the glass once more and found the reflection unchanged in posture, yet terrifyingly changed in presence. The future version of himself stood motionless, hammer in hand, his eyes locked with the kind of dull resignation found in people who have long accepted an ending that has not yet reached them. The glass began to fog from the other side, a faint bloom of condensation spreading outward in soft spirals, forming words he could not fully decipher but recognized in their shape. "Stop broadcasting." The whisper echoed the same sentiment, this time with a clarity that stole the strength from his legs. It was not a threat. It was a plea. Marcus reached toward the console with trembling fingers, the desire to shut everything down, battling with the dread that any action he took might accelerate whatever loop had brought the future version of himself into the room. The frequency hummed in response, its pitch sharpening until it formed a thin, piercing thread of sound that made the studio lights tremble. The whisper followed, layered with dozens of variations of his own voice, older, younger, brittle, furious, grieving, each overlapping in a broken chorus of timelines collapsing in on themselves. He heard the future voice speak again with the exhaustion of a man who had tried countless times to warn a past self who never listened. It described the moment Marcus would stop sleeping altogether, the moment the frequency would become the only sound he trusted, the moment he would reach for the hammer himself in a final attempt to silence a signal that could not die. The words twisted through Marcus's mind, comforting and horrifying in equal measure, and he felt the world compress around him, the booth shrinking like a lung exhaling its final breath. He stepped closer to the glass against his own will, drawn to his reflection not for its familiarity but because it felt like a doorway that had already been opened. The future version lifted the hammer once more, his posture slow and deliberate, as though each movement cost him more energy than he possessed. The whispering grew sharp, pressing itself into Marcus's awareness with surgical precision, forming a final message that did not sound like a warning but an instruction. It doesn't end unless you end it. End the broadcast. End the loop. End the part of you that won't stop listening. The reflection moved its lips in perfect sync with the whisper, and Marcus saw the words form clearly for the first time. Please. It was the pleading of a man who had suffered too long inside a self-made echo. The first strike came not from the reflection but from behind Marcus, a shattering metallic crack that split through the studio with the violence of a lightning bolt tearing open the sky. Marcus spun around too fast to find balance, his body collapsing partly against the console as the entire station seemed to jolt from the impact. The glass window separating him from the recording room trembled violently, hairline fractures racing across its surface like veins of spreading frost. The lights flickered out for a breath-long eternity before stuttering back into a weak glow, revealing that the reflection had moved no longer aligned with Marcus's position, but shifted several inches closer to the cracked glass. Another strike sounded, this one harder, more final, and Marcus watched in nauseated horror as the hammerhead appeared briefly on the other side of the fissured mirror, pressing against it as though testing its strength. The whispering inside the studio fell silent so abruptly it created a vacuum of sound, the dead air thicker and more suffocating than any noise could have been. Marcus attempted one last surge of action, diving toward the console in an attempt to cut the power, but the moment his fingers brushed the switch, the room erupted with a third and final blow. Glass exploded inward in a brittle cascade, the shards catching the fluorescent light in jagged fragments as the reflection stepped through the collapsing plane. Impossibly real and unbearably tired, Marcus stumbled backward, his breath frozen in his throat as he saw himself, older and hollow-eyed, clutching the hammer with hands that trembled not from effort but from resignation. The future version whispered the last line the frequency had promised, one shaped by sorrow, inevitability, and a strange, intimate mercy. You can stop broadcasting. The hammer dropped from the future self's hand before he dissolved into static light, scattering into the air like dust caught in an electronic pulse. The studio went silent, truly silent. For the first time in hours, Marcus sank to the floor, his fingers curled into the carpet, the console lights dimming one by one until only the faint glow of frequency X remained. It pulsed softly, an echo of an echo, no longer whispering but waiting. Marcus reached toward the switch with a steadying breath, unsure whether he was choosing freedom or surrender, unsure whether the loop had ever been something he had a chance to escape. He killed the broadcast. The station plunged into complete stillness, and in that stillness, a final whisper rose not from the speakers, not from the room, but from inside his own memory, shaped exactly like his voice would sound years from now. It thanked him, gently. He thought, for a moment, that the nightmare had ended. But as the building settled into its after-hours quiet, Marcus realized two things at once. The static was still faintly threading itself through the walls, and he, despite ending the broadcast, could still hear every frequency, even the ones no one had ever tuned, even the ones from versions of himself he had not yet become. His final thought, before the silence folded around him like a sealed vault, was a quiet, exhausted confession. I stopped broadcasting, but I never stopped listening. If you're hearing my voice now, it means you've stayed awake through the long hours, through the footsteps in empty skyways, through the pulse of crimson roots beneath the skin, through clocks that don't tick so much as choose, through hungry soil that remembers every name it consumes. and through a frequency that should never have answered you back. You made it to the end. Or perhaps the end simply circled around to find you. As the world outside begins to lighten faintly, reluctantly, you may find the dark feels different now. A little closer, a little softer, a little more aware, because the stories we carry with us after midnight have a way of lingering, settling into the quiet corners of our thoughts like dust on a forgotten shelf. And when the night returns, as it always does, they will be waiting. A footstep, a whisper, a pulse beneath the floorboards, a static hum buried beneath silence. But for now, rest. Let your heart beat slow. Let the shadows return to their places. The stories are done speaking, and they will not follow you past this moment, not until the next midnight. Thank you for listening, dear traveler of the dark. Until we meet again in the quiet hours, sleep gently, and try not to tune into anything that calls your name.